Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be talking about The Butchering Art, Joseph Lister's Quest to Transform the Grisly World of Victorian Medicine by Lindsey Fitzharris. Now, this is a really inspiring story. I think it's a really interesting story. I'm not obviously going to get into like every little tidbit of information that is in this book, but I am going to try my best to take you on Joseph Lister's journey, and I think that it is very inspiring and it's very encouraging, especially like how often many of us, probably most of us, get smacked down again and again and again by the things around us. And like in the pursuit of what we see as either our goal or even truth or, existing. And so I hope that like you'll listen to the story, get some inspiration, some encouragement from it, and just like how blessed we are for people like Joseph Lister. And it was the sort of inspiring story that made me think of also people like Elizabeth Packard, who I've talked about on this channel, and the adversity that they go through, the way that they carry themselves through adversity, and we're still only getting a snapshot. So it's not as if Joseph doesn't go through bouts of depression, but we're never actually going to see how it looked because we're getting the overview in the same way as when we're reading history, we get the overview instead of what the day-to-day build and grind and pain looked like. So there is that. What I hope is that maybe in talking about this book, you'll go and read it for yourself to see the details. But at the very least, I hope that you know that trailblazers, the people that make huge discoveries, or those who battle for rights like Elizabeth Packard, hold opinions that may not be popular at the time and may even seem crazy. They may be outcasted, and that every discovery also takes time to percolate, to populate, and to be believed by others. You'll never know the impact that you'll have on other people's lives just by being there and what you're pursuing. And in my opinion, the devil in your ear is there trying to stop you all the time by telling you how you don't matter until you give up, and your potential, your impact, and your life is buried. You are important. You can never see the impact that you're going to have, whether it's a huge impact like Joseph Lister had, or an impact in people's lives that keeps them going, that lets them know that they are loved, that changes the course of an individual's life from the nightmare to something worth living for. I hope you hear this story of a true man and what he went through to prove his discoveries to the world, and you see what you can do in your life and how much value you bring. And anyway, that is the intro. With that said, a couple of things first. Number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Leigh, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a short story, and you write a short story using that prompt, and on the first Monday of the month, we go over some of those submissions. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit the first chapter and the cover, that chapter will be read here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work. It's hopefully a chance to allow you to strut your stuff without like my personal biases getting involved or personal taste getting involved, because my book tastes are for certainly not anybody else's. I'm very particular, but aren't we all? And the third thing is, if you would like to check out any of my books, they're available at any of your favorite places to get books. I am working on these guys diligently again for the Westies one. It will be a trilogy with a prequel, because how do you have the legend of Bill Cassidy and never actually get to see Bill Cassidy in action? But I'm so excited to tie the stories together and to like show what is his legend, which is his kids, and then the life that he lived. So there's that. Also, because I was just thinking about this in the shower this morning, totally unrelated to anything, but now I'm making the promise, not a promise, but I'm saying it publicly to maybe hold myself accountable, because I got so much stuff to do, you guys. But I would like to get on writing Boom Shakalaka Boom after Westies 1 is in a good place, because I think that it would not be difficult to finish the draft. It's already like 35,000 words in. I kind of have an idea where I want to go, and it should be fairly light in general. So I'm hoping to work on that maybe between Westies 1 and Westies 2. But we'll see. We'll see. I keep thinking I want to work on Predisposed to Bliss also, but like I said, there's just so much to work on. Anyway, with that said, enough about me. Let's get into the book. And we're starting out with the prologue first page for the writing style. And the writing style of this is very good. It's very engaging. The author does an excellent job with descriptions, with pulling you in and giving just the right details to build the setting. And I just really love this writing style. And I'm saying this especially because I also, after I started reading this book, I picked up another book called Quackery, which is about a bunch of very bad ways in history in which medicine tried to heal things. And that book, the stories are interesting, but the narrative is much more jokey and it's much more, I don't want to say sophomoric, but it's not quite as engaging and it's much more sarcastic. And so this is taken more seriously, but it's also not dry. It's presented so well. You'll see what I'm saying because I'm going to give you so many quotes because I want you to see just what this journey is. So we're going to go on Joseph Lister's journey together. Quote, on the afternoon of December 21st, 1846, hundreds of men crowded into the operating theatre at London's University College Hospital, where the city's most renowned surgeon was preparing to enthrall them with a mild thigh amputation. As the people filed in, they were entirely unaware that they were about to witness one of the most pivotal moments in the history of medicine. The theater was filled to the rafters with medical students and curious spectators, many of whom had dragged in with them the dirt and grime of everyday life in Victorian London. The surgeon, John Flint South, remarked that the rush and scuffle to get a place in the operating theater was not unlike that for a seat in the pit or galley of a playhouse. People were packed like herrings in a basket, with those in the back rows constantly jostling for a better view, shouting out, "Heads! Heads!" whenever their line of sight was blocked. At times, the floor of the theater, like this one, could be so crowded that the surgeon couldn't operate until it had been partially cleared. Even though it was December, the atmosphere inside the theater was stifling, verging on unbearable. The crush of bodies made the place feel plaguey hot. The audience was made up of an eclectic group of men, some of whom were neither medical professionals nor students. The first two rows of an operating theater were typically occupied by hospital dressers, a term that referred to those who accompanied surgeons on their rounds carrying boxes of supplies needed to dress wounds. Behind the dressers stood the pupils, who restlessly pushed and murmured to one another in the back rows, as well as honored guests and other members of the public. Medical voyeurism was nothing new. It arose in the dimly lit anatomical amphitheaters of the Renaissance, where, in front of transfixed spectators, the bodies of executed criminals were dissected as an additional punishment for their crime. Ticketed spectators watched anatomists slice into the distended bellies of decomposing corpses, parts gushing forth not only human blood but also fetid pus. The lilting but incongruous notes of a flute sometimes accompanied the macabre demonstration. Public dissections were theatrical performances, a form of entertainment as popular as cockfighting or bear baiting. Not everyone had the stomach for it, though. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau said of the experience, "What a terrible sight an anatomy theater is! Stinking corpses, livid running flesh, blood, repellent intestines, horrible skeletons, pestilential vapors. Believe me, this is not the place where I will go looking for entertainment." So the majority of the prologue talks about different medical and surgery practices over the years, including Joseph Priestley's laughing gas, which was introduced in 1772, Franz Anton Mesmer's hypnotic technique of mesmerizing patients in the 1770s, which briefly got attention again in the 1830s. Quote, mesmerism enjoyed a brief revival in Britain in the 1830s when the physician John Elliotson began holding public displays at the University College Hospital, during which two of his patients, Elizabeth and Jane O'Kee, were able to predict the fate of other hospital patients. Under Elliotson's hypnotic influence, they claimed to see Big Jackie, otherwise known as Death, hovering over the bed of those who later died. Any serious interest in Elliotson's method was short-lived, however. In 1838, the editor of The Lancet, the world's leading medical journal, tricked the O'Kee sisters into confessing their fraud, thus exposing Elliotson as a charlatan. And then there was also the Yankee Dodge that became popular. Quote, it was referred to as the Yankee Dodge due to its being first used as a general anesthetic in America. It had been discovered in 1275, but its stupefying effects weren't synthesized until 1540, when the German botanist and chemist Valerius Cordus created a revolutionary formula that involved adding sulfuric acid to ethyl alcohol. His contemporary Paracelsus experimented with ether on chickens, noting that when the birds drank the liquid, they would undergo prolonged sleep and awake unharmed. He concluded that the substance quiets all suffering without any harm, and relieves all pain, and quenches all fevers, and prevents complications in all diseases. Yet it would be several hundred years before it was tested on humans. Yeah, we're gonna have brief sections in here where people are undergoing surgery without anesthetic, and it's frightening. It's ask yourself. This is where the question yesterday came from. It's like, ask yourself, if you had to go under a deep surgery to get like something that is painful taken care of, would you do it if you didn't have anesthetic and you had to be awake the entire time and feel everything? The closest I'd ever been to that was, I mean, technically I got my wisdom teeth pulled and I was awake the whole time. They just used Novocaine in my teeth, or in my jaw, I guess, whatever, in my gums. And then the guy like braced himself on the chair. Like he literally, I can still remember. It's kind of wild to think about, okay? Because the dentist office was under construction. This was the first time I'd ever been to this specific dentist office, who was right before I moved to Florida, because I was like, I want to get this done before I move to Florida. I hadn't seen a dentist in a couple of years. I don't remember why. So I booked with this guy because I was always afraid. I had always been afraid to have my wisdom teeth pulled out because my brother had gotten so sick when he got his taken out that he was vomiting for days, if not weeks at a time, and it was just bad. So I was scared to get them taken out. And so at that point, they were like partially in, they were impounded and getting infected every so often. And I was like, okay, I don't think I want to deal with this and then have to deal with this in Alaska, or once I moved to Florida all by myself. So I booked an appointment with this dentist, and you walk in and it's like the lobby is under construction, and it was in like this tall building. It wasn't like a devoted single floor building. There was, I just remember plastic hanging over the door, the hallway from where the singular reception desk was, because they didn't have a door, and then there was just plastic all over the different chairs, like construction plastic, and that was what was separating the different chair rooms. And so there was plastic hanging over where my chair was that I was brought into. And so I got a cleaning. Oh, that's what it was. I didn't go in to get my teeth. I went in to get a basic cleaning. That was it. And then the guy was like, "Hey, so your teeth are impounded. I could take them out right now." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." And so then that's how I ended up getting my wisdom teeth removed, because I was just there for routine. And so then he's like, okay, I'm going to shoot you up with Novocaine and you let me know when you don't feel it anymore. And so then I did. And then he just like braced himself on the chair. Like he put his foot on the chair and leaned over me with the pliers and like pulled them out one by one. And then I left. And obviously, since I just went in there for routine care, I had gone there by myself. So then I remember like driving home and just feeling my mouth filling with blood. And so I was kind of driving like this, that I get home. And then my mom is like, "Hey, are you okay?" And I'm like, "Ah." And I'm like, got blood. I feel blood going down my chin. And so then obviously I go and I spit it out and wash my mouth out. And I tell her what happened. And she's like, "Okay." And then that was also the night that we were going to go and have dinner with my oldest brother and his wife, because they were moving to Vera Beach at the time. And so then we went to Red Robin's, and I got fish. I got some like fried cod and some French fries. And I ate. Yes, I ate the same day that I had my wisdom teeth removed. So that's the story of that. Anyway, the other closest thing, I was like, how did I get here? No anesthetic. I did have anesthetic though, so that hardly counts, but it does count because I was awake the whole time. The other closest thing that I have was when I had an abscess removed from my stomach. The doctor put some numbing thing in there, but it didn't really go deep enough for how deep he was going in there. But so I was awake the whole time, and I'm feeling him cut a hole in that area and then like reaching in and scraping it out, and it wore off very quickly because I processed pain med. Like they had to keep putting Novocaine in my face when I was getting my teeth pulled, and then my jaw was just dead for a couple of hours. But yeah, I could feel him in there scraping. And then by the time that I left the office after, because that took like maybe 10 minutes, if that. And then by the time we were walking back to the car in the parking garage, I could already feel all of the pain from the new hole that was in in my stomach. Anyway, those are my closest experience. I would not want to have a deep surgery like friggin' removal of bladder stone, which we're gonna get. There's a description of it in here. It is frightening. I would not want to get a mastectomy or any other type of cancer removal surgery without anesthetic. I would not want to get amputated without anesthetic. Like, what the heck? So looking at old medicine, and I guess that you could look at the current medicine, but especially in old medicine, the extent of the claims have always been incredible. Like, it's like, hey, this medicine will cure your headaches, it'll disinfect your wounds, it'll cure your depression, and it'll help your marriage. Quote, on November 18th, 1846, Dr. Henry Jacob Bigelow wrote about this groundbreaking moment in Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. It has long been an important problem in the medical sciences to devise some method of mitigating the pain of surgical operations. An efficient agent for this purpose has at length been discovered. Bigelow went on to describe how Morton had administered what he called lethion to the patient before the operation commenced. This was a gas named after the river Leigh in classical mythology, which made the souls of the dead forget their lives on earth. Morton, who had patented the composition of the gas shortly after the operation, kept its parts secret, even from the surgeons. Bigelow revealed, however, that he could detect the sickly sweet smell of ether in it. News about the miraculous substance that could render people unconscious during surgery spread quickly about the world as surgeons rushed to test the effects of ether on their own patients. Enter Dr. Robert Liston. I know we're taking a while to get to Dr. Joseph Lister, but there are so many, one, we're in the prologue, and two, there are so many that contributed to the knowledge that Dr. Lister had, and that allowed him to discover, because we're going to get into even more things, and he makes a best friend chemist without even trying, and is influenced by that man, and we're going to get there. So Dr. Robert Liston heard about this ether during surgery, the success of a recent experiment, and wanted to try it for himself. We also get this discussion of the boys' club that was and is the medical community's legacy. Quote, Liston arrived on the scene in London at a time when gentlemen physicians held considerable power and influence over the medical community. They were part of the ruling elite, forming a top of the medical pyramid. As such, they acted as gatekeepers for their profession, admitting only men whom they believed had good breeding and high moral standing. They themselves were the bookish types with very little practical training who used their minds, not their hands, to treat patients. Their education was rooted in the classics. It was not uncommon in this period for physicians to prescribe treatments without first performing a physical examination. Indeed, some dispensed medical advice through letters alone, never laying eyes on the patient in question. It's kind of interesting, especially after watching Windigoon's recent video about Dr. Death and the cover-up that happened with him that was only like 10, 15 years ago, maybe, and all of the cover-up that happened with the Texas doctors who had their medical license revoked in other states. In my opinion, looking at any background in any of this, doctors and frankly no occupation should ever be elevated to some upper position of better men. They're still just humans with the same flaws that any of us are able to have, including a desire to harm people or arrogance. In some cases, those drawn to powerful positions may have a god complex of some kind. They may be incompetent like Dr. Death, and should all be treated with a fair skepticism as much as they're treated with fair trust for their credentials and respect. But there should be no just like given, oh, because you're this, then you've just got it. Like, this is talking about dispensing medical advice without ever seeing a patient. I've been misdiagnosed and mistreated before by medical staff too, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one. It's not some old thing that's out of hat or doesn't happen anymore. Quote, many surgeons in the first decades of the 19th century didn't attend university. Some were even illiterate. Directly below them were the apothecaries who were in charge of dispensing drugs. In theory, there was a clear demarcation between the surgeon and the apothecary. In practice, a man who had been apprenticed to a surgeon might also act as an apothecary and vice versa. This gave rise to the unofficial fourth category, the surgeon apothecary, who was akin to the modern general practitioner. The surgeon apothecary was a doctor of first resort for the poor, especially outside of London. It was during 1821 and 1839 when the first hospital colleges appeared to provide training. Okay, so now let's return to Dr. Robert Liston, considered as a notable surgeon for his time. Do you want to know what his resume looked like? Quote, it was said by Liston It was said of Liston by his colleagues that when he amputated, the gleam of his knife was followed so simultaneously by the sound of sawing as to make the two actions appear almost simultaneous. His left arm was reportedly so strong that he could use it as a tourniquet while he wielded the knife in his right hand. This was a feat that required immense strength and dexterity, given that patients often struggled against the fear and agony of the surgeon's assault. Liston could remove a leg in less than 30 seconds, and in order to keep both hands free, he often clasped the bloody knife between his teeth while working. Liston's speed was both a gift and a curse. Once he accidentally sliced off a patient's testicle along with the leg that he was amputating. His most famous and possibly quite possibly apocryphal mishap involved an operation during which he worked so rapidly that he took off 3 of his assistant's fingers and, while switching blades, slashed the spectator's coat. Both the assistant and the patient died later of gangrene, and the unfortunate bystander expired on the spot from fright. It is the only surgery in history said to have had a 300% fatality rate. Imagine doing such a medical job that you kill a bystander with fright. Quote, although Liston was all too aware of what awaited his patients on the operating table, he often downplayed the horrors for the sake of protecting their nerves. Just months before his experiment with ether, he removed the leg of a 12-year-old child named Henry Pace, who had been suffering from tubercular swelling on the right knee. The boy asked the surgeon whether the operation would hurt, and Liston responded no more than having a tooth out. When the moment came to have the leg removed, Pace was brought into the theater blindfolded and pinned down by Liston's assistants. The boy counted 6 strokes of a saw before his leg dropped off. 60 years later, Pace would recount the story to medical students at University College London, the horror of the experience no doubt fresh in his mind as he sat in the very hospital in which he had lost his leg. Not to say that you shouldn't trust doctors somewhat, but also, they're a necessary evil, for they do help with many things, but also I don't have a doubt in my mind that patients are often science experiments because it's the only way to really learn how to use certain things or how bodies respond. It's just a piece of information you should know. Quote, like many surgeons operating in a pre-anesthetic era, Liston had learned to steel himself against the cries and protests of those strapped to the blood-splattered operating table. On one occasion, Liston's patient, who had come in to have a bladder stone removed, ran from the room in terror and locked himself in a lavatory before the procedure could begin. Liston, hot on his heels, broke the door down and dragged the screaming patient back to the operating room. There, he bound the man fast before passing a curved metal tube up the patient's penis and into the bladder. He then slid a finger into the man's rectum, feeling for the stone. Once Liston had located it, his assistant removed the metal tube and replaced it with a wooden staff, which acted as a guide so the surgeon wouldn't fatally rupture the patient's rectum or intestines as he began cutting deep into the bladder. Once the staff was in place, Liston cut diagonally through the fibrous muscle of the scrotum until he reached the wooden staff. Next, he used the probe to widen the hole, ripping open the prostate gland in the process. At this point, he removed the wooden staff and used forceps to extract the stone from the bladder. Liston, who reportedly had the fastest knife in the West End, achieved all of this in just under 60 seconds. Probably the longest 60 seconds of that man's life. Look, tell me. So this is pre-anesthetic. You're awake the whole time. Would you keep the bladder stone or would you go through this? Let's just have a moment of silence for those who suffered under the pre-anesthesia like this. They get to start using the ether and they want to try it, picking up random people out of the gallery to do so. There was a fat man who loved liquor, and after taking a couple breaths of ether, he jumped off of the table, cursed the doctor and the crowd, and then ran out of the room. There was no time to test it any further as an emergency patient, Frederick Churchill, was brought in, and they had to use it for real. Quote, the young man had suffered from chronic osteoelitis of the tibia, a bacterial bone infection which had caused his right knee to swell and become violently bent. His first operation came 3 years earlier. On November 23, 1846, Churchill was once again back in the hospital. A few days later, Liston made an incision and passed a probe into his knee. Using his unwashed hands, Liston felt for the bone to ensure that it wasn't loose. He ordered that the opening be washed with warm water and dressed, and that the patient be allowed to rest. Over the next few days, however, Churchill's condition deteriorated. He soon experienced sharp pain that radiated from his hip to his toes. This occurred again 3 weeks later, after which Liston decided that the leg had to come off. As Liston prepares to perform this surgery on Churchill, he turns to the gallery and tells them that the show is about to start. This is after the ether has already been given to the patient. After the surgery, the patient woke up and asked when the surgery would be. The ether had been a complete success at killing the pain and putting the patient out while the surgery was done. There was no struggle, there was no screaming, the gallery rejoiced. Now enter the main focus of the book, Joseph Lister, who was present in the gallery that day, and he saw a world of medicine changing before him, and hope sprung in him to not have to watch screaming, unhappy, fearful patients run out of the room and cry in pain as work was done for them. As much of a success as anesthesia was, it caused its own problems with the arrogance of the doctors who used it. Quote, as it turned out, the 2 decades immediately following the popularization of anesthesia saw surgical outcomes worsen. With their newfound confidence about operating without inflicting pain, surgeons became even more willing to take up the knife, driving up the incidence of post-operative infection and shock. Operating theaters became filthier than ever as the number of surgeries increased. Surgeons still lacking in understanding of the cause of infection would operate on multiple patients in succession using the same unwashed instruments on each occasion. The more crowded the operating theater became, the less likely it was that even the most primitive sanitary precautions would be taken. And this is what caught Joseph's eye. He wanted to get to the bottom of what was causing infection and what was causing all of these people to die post surgery. So now we can begin his story. Yeah, that was all just in the prologue to kind of set up the medical apparatus, the current forms of medical advancement, and where everything was and what he was involved in. So first we get introduced to Joseph Lister's birth and family. It was a very religious Quaker family, which also meant that there weren't very many pastimes that they believed in, because most of them were just considered frivolous distractions from praising God. Science, however, was not one of those things, and Joseph quickly got his own microscope as a child and grew a passion for looking through it. Though many people didn't see microscopes as anything other than child's playthings, kind of like looking at through a kaleidoscope, but Joseph Lister saw something else in it. He saw a possibility of something to learn from, though he wasn't sure what to use it for yet. He also announced that he wanted to get into working in surgery early on. The announcement surprised his family. Surgeons at the time were not really respected or considered as anything other than low-tier handy workers or, blue-collar workers. They weren't kept on staff at the hospital, they were paid poorly, and they had a poor reputation because they were really just considered butchers. They had a high mortality rate. And they pretty much did stuff like very much barbarian. Like, you were chasing people, you were chasing a child into the lavatory, pulling him out screaming and holding him down to a table to cut off his leg. I understand why you didn't have the best reputation. Still, that's what Joseph wanted to do. There is a bit in here about how the population in London skyrocketed at the time in the 1800s from 1 million to 6 million, and the city amenities just couldn't keep up with the population, so there were flies everywhere, there was stink everywhere, there was filth everywhere, corpses overflowed the churches and the graveyards, and the stink and nastiness of human and animal waste couldn't be kept up with for disposal, so the city just it was a toilet, it was a graveyard of bodies that were decomposing in public. It was stank. Joseph eventually started attending the University College London, which was the first school built in the area that did not have religious requirements. Quote, it was the first university in the country that didn't require its students to attend daily Anglican church service, a fact that suited Lister quite well. Later, rivals from King College would label those who attended UCL the godless scum of Gower Street, referring to the thoroughfare on which the university was located. The curriculum at UCL would be as radical as the secular foundations on which it was built, the founders decided. The university was to feature the traditional subjects like those taught at Oxford and Cambridge, as well as new ones such as geography, architecture, and modern history. The medical school, in particular, would have an advantage over the 2 universities due to its proximity to the Northern London Hospital, later known as University College Hospital, built 6 years after UCL was founded. There were many who balked at the idea of a university being established in London. The satirical newspaper, John Bull, questioned the suitability of the raucous city as a place in which to educate Britain's young minds. With trademark sarcasm, the newspaper quipped, "The morality of London, its quietude and celebrity, appeared to combine to render the capital the most convenient place for the education of the youth." The article continued by imagining that the university would be built in the notorious slums near Westminster Abbey named Tothill Fields. In order to meet any objections which heads of family may make to the perilous exposure to their sons of the casualties arising from the crowded streets, a large body of plain respectable females of middle age will be engaged to attend students to and from the college in the mornings and evenings of each day. Amid protests and concerns, however, the edifice of UCL was built, and the school began accepting students in October of 1828. Joseph enlisted in an unusual background for his degree, at the behest, at the encouragement of his father, who was one of his biggest supporters throughout his entire life. Quote, UCL had only 3 facilities, arts, medicine, and law. In keeping with his father's wishes, Lister completed an arts degree first, which was akin to the modern-day liberal arts foundation, consisting of a variety of courses in history, literature, mathematics, and science. This was an unconventional route into surgery because most students bypassed this step altogether in the 1840s and jumped right into a medical. Later in life, Lister would credit his broad background and his ability to connect scientific theories to medical practice. And maybe I'm a bit biased because I have an arts degree as well. As well as a psychology degree, but I do think that approaching things from different perspectives does help you open your mind to maybe being less, this is how it has to be done, this is all that we have, and it gives you the permission to explore. And I don't know about you, but I've run into a lot of people who are afraid to look stupid, who only look at things by the book, and are afraid to just play and have fun or look at things creatively from a different perspective, even ask stupid questions, which I do all the time. You guys see it multiple times with the community tab. I just throw out silly questions because we're going to have some discussion. But I look at things and I just ask silly things. And that's actually how I got into working IT, is I had a creative background and they were like, we're trying to do automation. We need to have a creative person kind of bring a creative problem solving to this issue. So I do think being well-rounded helps, at least getting out of your comfort zone a little bit or doing something opposite to what you normally would do helps expand the way that you use your brain. I think you can specialize and just go at something for that specialty, but I think you underestimate the help that it'll give you if you allow yourself to even just trickle in a little bit of something different off to the side. So Joseph Lister stood out in school, both because of his height, he was a very tall man, and his straight-laced Quaker apparel, because even though he was going to a more secular school, he was still a Quaker, and that was one of the reasons why he didn't want to go to any of the Anglican schools, is because he was not Anglican, and he never stops practicing he willingly leaves the church later, but he never actually stops being a Quaker, and we'll get to that. He abstained from all forms of art and distraction, focusing on school instead, which was apparently uncommon for medical students at the time. Quote, at the time, the term medical student had become a byword for vulgar riot and dissipation, according to physician William Augustus Guy. This sentiment was universal. An American journalist observed that medical students in New York were apt to be lawless, exuberant, and addicted to nocturnal activity. They were often a rough-looking lot who congregated in cheap lodgings and inns surrounding the great teaching hospitals. They were dressed fashionably, almost gaudily, except for their distinctly grim shirts. They walked around with cigars hanging from their mouths, an indulgence but one that was necessary for masking the smell of decay that permeated their clothes after they'd spent a time in the dissection, judging by the number of warnings against bad behavior that instructors gave to their pupils. Kind of wild that university students have always been that stereotype. When Joseph Lister went to college, he took with him all of the typical medical school supplies because you had to bring your own medical bag with those supplies, but he also brought a microscope, which he was mocked for by his instructors. Quote, many of Lister's instructors still believed the microscope was not only superfluous to the study of surgery, but also a threat to the medical establishment itself. Even with improvements like Joseph Jackson's achromatic lens, the instrument continued to be regarded with suspicion by those within the medical community, many of whom lacked the skill and training to operate one effectively. What revelations did the microscope offer? Surely all relevant signs and symptoms could be observed with the naked eye. And could any of these microscopic discoveries actually lead to effective treatment of patients? Unless the instrument offered clear benefits that were applicable to the practice of medicine and surgery, most concluded that there was no reason to waste time with it. It's interesting that it's like, I'm not even willing to humor looking into something, because if it doesn't immediately offer a benefit that we know of right now, then it never will. And it's so stupid to just experiment with it. Like, people have always been fairly close-minded to the idea of exploration, to doing something a little different and exploring. And if you try to do it, then they mock you for being stupid and wasting your time on something, when this is how you make discovery. Not to mention, the French were already using the microscope in medicine well before anyone else, and despite how his instructors felt, Joseph continued to use his microscope to analyze human tissue and to work on finding the best size of human tissue for reading through the microscope. Even when he got some praise for his advanced use of the microscope, he didn't feel like it was enough and planned to push forward, believing that there was more that he could do with the microscope than what he had already achieved, and they were heavily overlooking. Medical students also often had to have separate sets of clothing for when dissecting, and also how closely the medical students lived with the bodies at the time, because there were just bodies all around campus for dissection rooms and classes, which caused an issue in some ways that you may or may not expect. Quote, "For the uninitiated, the dissection room was a waking nightmare. The French composer and former medical student Hector Berlioz jumped out of a window and ran home, later recalling that it was as though death himself and all of his grisly band were hot on my heels the first time that he stepped into the dissection room. He described an overwhelming feeling of revulsion at the sight of the limbs scattered about, the heads smirking, the skulls gaping, the bloody cesspool underfoot, and the repulsive stench of the place. One of the worst sights, he thought, was the rats nibbling on bleeding vertebrae and the swarms of sparrows pecking at the leftover scraps of spongy lung tissue. The profession was not for everyone." Students working with these bodies, obviously we got a very macabre setting, a very gross setting, and so one of the things that medical students had to do was learn how to objectify humans so that they no longer looked like people, they no longer felt like people, but it was basically like looking at a corpse was like looking at a chair. And this allowed the medical students to, one, do what they had to do, but it also, when you dehumanize people, you start doing weird things. Quote, "Today, we disparagingly call this apparent coldness clinical detachment, but in Lister's day it was described as a necessary inhumanity. The French anatomist Joseph Guillard de Verney remarked that by seeing and practicing on dead bodies, we lose foolish tenderness so that we can hear them cry without any disorder. This was not simply a byproduct of the medical education, it was a goal. As medical students became desensitized, they also became irreverent, much to the public's horror. Pranks in the dead house were so common that by the time Lister entered medical school, they had become a mark of the profession. Harper's New Monthly Magazine condemned jet-black humor and indifference towards the dead that pervaded the dissection room. Some students completely overstepped the bounds of decency and used the rotting body parts of their allotted cadavers as weapons, fighting mock duels with severed legs and arms. Others smuggled entrails out of the room and secreted them in places where they would shock and horrify the uninitiated when discovered. One surgeon remembered curious spectators visiting the dissection room when he was a student. These outsiders wore double-breasted jackets and often received in their tailcoats free donations of available appendages. There was a time when Joseph Lister was in medical school that he not only caught a case of smallpox, but one of his brothers also got a brain tumor. It was then, when his brother died, that he realized the limitations of medicine and had a bit of an existential crisis, a pause in like, why am I pursuing this when it is so limited that we'll never be able to do anything with the brain, that we'll never be able to stop some of these things that are afflicting humanity? And he wasn't sure if he should continue to pursue medicine, if it was a waste of time because his brother died of a brain tumor and you could never do anything for that. He considered, maybe I should quit medicine and go back to learning, about being a pastor and then spread the Bible and be a Quaker pastor. But his father saw much more in his abilities and his curiosity and the future that he could have as a surgeon. And so his father told him, For the good of the church, for the good of mankind, you should continue to pursue medicine because you have something special. Your skills are something special. Eventually, with his father's encouragement, Joseph did return to school and continued to study, and there his passion reignited. So it wasn't that like he didn't have a passion in it and he was just kind of forcing himself to do it, but as the majority of us probably, I'm making a massive assumption here, but even when we love something, when we run into life events, we have existential crises that make us wonder, like, what the frick we're even doing. I know that I've hit that with writing more than a couple times where I've been like, I'm just spinning wheels. I'm just wasting time. Like, what the heck am I doing? My entire life is a waste of time. What am I doing? It's not even worth existing. And I can be so full of passion for something, but then still, have something happen and question the pursuit altogether as well as personal worth. Anyway, hospitals also did not have the greatest reputations, as often people died, if not on the operating table, then shortly after the operation because of complications and infection. Quote, admittedly, a number of London hospitals in the first half of the 19th century were rebuilt and extended in line with the demands placed upon them by the city's growing population. For instance, St. Thomas's Hospital received a new anatomical theater and museum in 1813, and St. Bartholomew's Hospital underwent several structural improvements between 1822 and 1854, which increased the number of patients it could receive. 3 teaching hospitals were also built during this time, including University College Hospital in 1834. Despite these changes, and because of these enlargements suddenly brought hundreds of patients into proximity with one another, the hospitals were known by the public as houses of death. Some only admitted patients who brought with them money to cover their almost inevitable burial. Others, like St. Thomas, charged double if the person in question was deemed foul by the admission officer. The surgeon James Y. Simpson remarked as late as 1869 that a soldier has more chance of survival in a field of Waterloo than a man who goes into a hospital. That's pretty bad. Ugh. When knowing that, would you take your chances in the hospital? Now, it's not surprising that this was the case when these are the described conditions. Quote, in spite of token efforts to make hospitals cleaner, most remained overcrowded, grimy, and poorly managed. They were breeding grounds for infection and provided only the most primitive facilities for the sick and dying, many of whom were housed on wards with little ventilation or access to clean water. Surgical incisions made in large city hospitals were so vulnerable to infection that operations were restricted to only the most urgent cases. The sick often languished in filth for long periods before they received medical attention because most hospitals were disastrously understaffed. In 1825, visitors to the St. George's Hospital discovered mushrooms and maggots thriving in the damp, dirty sheets of a patient recovering from a compound fracture. The afflicted man, believing this to be the norm, had not complained about the conditions, nor had any of the fellow wardmates thought the squalor especially noteworthy. Living with growing mushrooms and maggots and thinking that that is normal, that is how disgusting the average hospital was. That's incredible. Think of what hospitals look like now. The death rates then continued to climb. Quote, because surgeons saw suffering on a daily basis, very few felt any need to address the issue that they saw as inevitable and commonplace. Most surgeons were interested in the individual bodies of their patients, not hospital populations and statistics. They were largely unconcerned with the causes of diseases, choosing instead to focus on diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. Lister, however, would soon form his own opinions about the parlous state of the hospital wards and what could be done to address what he saw as a growing humanitarian crisis. One thing to make sure that is clear, there's Robert Liston and Joseph Lister. If I say Liston, I mean Robert Liston. After Dr. Robert Liston and Dr. Porter died, the hospital lost so much money because those were their best surgeons, their most renowned surgeons. The number of beds had to be shrunk due to funding. And many people left so they could go work under other renowned surgeons in other hospitals. It was around this time in the 1840s and the 50s when different people were trying to better understand why people were dying so often in the hospitals, what was causing infection. Something that made Joseph Lister stand out was that he was a bit of a hypochondriac, though that would more develop later in his life, and his mother often suffered from recurring outbreaks of erysipelas. The most commonly held belief at the time eventually became one that of the anti-contagionists. Quote, While many medical practitioners recognize that neither of the two theories provided a comprehensive explanation for how infectious disease spread, most hospital surgeons sided with the anti-contagionists by pointing to contaminated air in overcrowded wards as the cause of hospitalism. The French called the phenomena hospital poisoning. At the University College Hospital, Erickson concurred. He maintained that patients were infected by miasma arising from corrupted wounds. The air, he thought, would become saturated with poisonous gases, which in turn were inhaled by patients. This miasma might appear to be at any season of the year and under any circumstances and acquire extreme virulence if the crowding together of the operated or injured be excessive. Erickson estimated that more than 7 patients with an infected wound in a 14-bed ward could lead to an irreversible outbreak of any one of the 4 principal hospital diseases. He could barely be blamed for thinking so. Surgeons began to question the impact that large hospitals were having on their patients' abilities to recover and were beginning to isolate patients post-op who had infectious outbreaks. This started to show them better recovery, and it stopped some of the outbreaks when the infections were put into isolation. The hospital college that Joseph Lister worked at still used candles. One night when he was there, a cop came in with a completely brutalized and dying woman, and that included this little tidbit, quote, "Just then, the doors burst open. Lister raised the candle to reveal the face of a frantic policeman. In the officer's arms was an unconscious woman. She had been stabbed in the gut, and although the wound was small, slick coils of her intestines had started to protrude from her body." Most senior surgeon on duty. He was the only surgeon on duty. He set the candle down and got to work. The young woman now in Lister's care was Julian Sullivan, a mother of 8 who had fallen victim to her husband's alcohol-fueled temper. Domestic abuse was not a rarity in Victorian England. Wife beating was a national pastime, and women like Julia were often treated like property by their husbands. Some men even put their own wives and children up for sale after they tired of them. One deed for such sale declared that Mr. Osborne does agree to part with his wife, Mary Osborne, and the child to Mr. William Sergeant for a sum of £1, consideration of giving up all claim. In another instance, a journalist wrote of a butcher who had dragged his wife to Smithfield Market with a halter about her neck and one about her waist, which tied her to a railing. The husband ended up selling his wife to a happy purchaser who paid the man 3 guineas and a crown for his departed rib. Between 1800 and 1850, there were more than 200 recorded cases of wife sales in England. Undoubtedly, there were more than that went unreported. It is interesting, especially because slavery had been abolished in England in 1772. However, you could still sell your wife and kids, apparently, or beat them to death. So do with that information what you will. Quote, "There was little legal protection for the victimized women in the middle 19th century. The editor of the Times criticized the lenient sentences handed out by magistrates of the courts to abusive husbands, opining that the conjugal tie appears to be considered as conferring on a man a certain degree of impunity for brutality towards the woman. These violent men lived in a society that turned a blind eye to their abuse. The general populace had grown so accustomed to the idea that men were allowed to beat women and children that it practically sanctioned this behavior. On May 31, 1850, a writer of the Morning Chronicle commented, 'It is evident to all who take any pains to read the indications of the feelings of the populace that they are impressed with the belief that they are having a right to inflict almost any amount of corporal violence on their wife or their children. That anyone should claim to interfere with this supposed right causes them unaffected surprise. It is not their wife or child. Are they not entitled to do what they will with their own?' These phrases are not, to their apprehension, metaphorical. The shoe on their feet, the cudgel in their hand, the horse or ass that carries their burden, the wife and children are all theirs, and all in the same sense." The rest of this follows telling the story of Julia, where she had run away from her husband recently for him beating her mercilessly, constantly, and she went in to live with her friend for safety. Her husband stalked her and waited for her and her friend at her friend's house before demanding that she come home. She didn't feel safe coming home, so the friend suggested that they go to a local pub and talk out whatever the problems are. At the pub, the husband threatened his wife, suggesting that he had a weapon on him, but when she asked him what he was doing, By reaching into his pocket, he denied it. At the pub, the husband accused Julia of cheating again before stabbing her in public. The rules of the hospital at the time were also very strict, and you could only be admitted on certain days at certain times. Quote, most hospitals had a taking-in day designated for admitting new patients onto the wards. This might happen only once a week. In 1835, the Times reported an incident in which a young woman suffering from a fistula, inflammation of the brain, and consumption was turned away from Guy's Hospital in London on a Monday because taking-in day was on Friday. Returning on the appropriate day, the woman arrived 10 minutes late and was refused admittance because of her lack of punctuality. Dejected and seriously ill, she returned to the countryside where she died a few days later. In the 19th century, almost all of the hospitals in London, except for Royal Free Control inpatient admission through the system of ticketing. One could obtain a ticket from one of the hospital's subscribers who had paid an annual fee in exchange for the right to recommend patients to the hospital and vote in elections of medical staff. Securing a ticket required tireless soliciting on the part of the potential patients who might spend days waiting and calling upon the servants of subscribers and begging their way into the hospital. Preference was given to acute cases. Incurables, people with cancer or tuberculosis, for instance, were turned away, as were people with venereal infection. Who would have thought that medical was doing subscription-based services hundreds of years before Netflix? Now, Julia is a notable case because the choices that Joseph Lister made that day brought her to full recovery to everyone's impress. And he also later went to court to testify against the husband who was being charged with attempted murder. The man was convicted and sent to Australia for 20 years, and this was noted as Joseph Lister's first major surgery that he performed on his own, and also a major success as she did not die from infection. When talking about the types of illnesses and the number of people who died at the hospital, syphilis is brought up as something that surgeons usually cured, as at the time, surgeons focused on external medicines, which meant dealing with the symptoms and deformities on the outward appearance. Quote, the symptoms syphilis engendered worsened over time. In addition to the unsightly skin ulcers that pockmarked the body in the later stages of the disease, many victims endured paralysis, blindness, dementia, and saddle nose, a grotesque deformity that occurs when the bridges of the nose cave into the face. Syphilis was so common that no nose clubs sprung out all over London. One newspaper reported that an eccentric gentleman, having taken a fancy to seeing large parties of noseless persons, invited everyone thus afflicted, whom he met in the streets, to dine on a certain day at a tavern, where he formed them into a brotherhood. The man who assumed the alias Mr. Crampton for these clandestine parties entertained his noseless friends every month for a year until his death, at which time the group unhappily dissolved. So he had a noseless man support group. Joseph Lister was paying a lot of attention in general to STDs and other things that transfer germs, though at the time they still were unaware of how infectious TB was, and they weren't really paying much mind when they sent TB patients out because they came in with TB. They didn't think that the coughing was contagious because it didn't line up with their contagion theory. He also was continuing his studies and experiments with his microscope, while others still dismissed it as a toy, saying it had no value. He was also heavily inspired by a physiology professor named William Sharpie, and this brought new fervor to his studies. Quote, spurred on by Sharpie's enthusiasm, Lister began to observe as much human tissue under his microscope as he could acquire. His sketches revealed intricate details of everything from human skin to the cells of a cancerous tongue, which had been cut out of a patient. Lister also created full-color clinical paintings of patients that he encountered at his hospital. This was the only method of recording case histories visually before the advent of color photography. In one such painting, Lister portrayed a man leaning back, his arm resting on a chair, his sleeve is rolled up, and his skin is pockmarked with angry sores, probably venereal in nature. In 1852, Lister made a first major contribution to science using the microscope when he turned his attention to a human eye after obtaining a portion of fresh blue iris from Wharton Jones, a university professor of ophthalmology. Lister was interested in the debate concerning the nature of tissue in the constrictor and the dilator muscles of the iris. The Swiss physiologist Albert von Kolliker had recently described the tissue as comprising smooth muscle cells like the kind found in the stomach, the blood vessels, or the bladder. The actions of this type of muscle are involuntary. Kolliker's discovery was in opposition to the view upheld by one of England's most eminent ophthalmologist William Bowman, who believed that the tissue was striped or striated, which would make the muscle movements voluntary. Still, despite his work with a microscope, people still thought that it was esoteric and no one really was interested in it. As diseases broke out, Lister took it upon himself to start scraping everything that he could to look at them under the microscope, including the spread of ulcers and gangrene. When he finished school, he was put at the bottom of the honors list, not because his work was subpar. His work was actually excellent and he was making interesting and unique discoveries, but his instructors and everyone doubted his work with a microscope. The dean of Lister's program even said that if he could disallow Lister from being on the honors list because of his use of the microscope, he would, but his work in general was just too good that there was no way to say you can't be on the list, so he just got to be at the bottom. Because of this, Joseph Lister was so full of self-doubt. Nobody at his university, nobody at his profession believed in him. While he did become registered to be a surgeon, he lacked confidence in himself, so his mentor suggested that he travel to Europe for a bit and try different hospitals, try working under different hospitals, get some worldview around what different people are doing outside of London because other people were practicing differently. Now, William Sharpie, his mentor, believed that the first place that he should visit would be his good friend James Syme in Scotland. The man was doing similar investigations into the nature of inflammation and blood circulation and believed that the personalities between Joseph Lister and James Syme would be a very good match. Now, the conditions in Scotland at the time were not great, to say the least. Overcrowding and filthy, with the average single bedroom housing 25 people. There were many Irishmen who were immigrating here due to the potato famine, and everything was just nasty from the overcrowding because nothing could sustain or take care of the number of people that were there. The fact that the city wasn't set up for the population size, and it was during this time that body snatching had actually become very common in order to make money and have cadavers to work on. In fact, it was during this very time when the very famous pair of body snatchers, Burke and Hare, made their business of stealing corpses that were then being sold to hospitals for practice. As terrible as it sounds of people stealing bodies and digging up bodies to then be sold for, beer money, it was because of this body snatching that Scotland's medical apparatus was able to advance as much as it did, putting it ahead of others because they had more live samples, or dead samples. Joseph Lister found that he really admired James Syme and was much more happy to be his apprentice than he had been in London, even though Joseph had the credentials to be a surgeon. He was now lowering himself to a position of a student just so he could study underneath James Syme. He had some great successes while working with Syme, even if everything wasn't a success for him, and some people ended up dying. It's kind of just the nature of it. He had initially only planned to stay in Scotland for a month, but they jived so well that he stayed longer. So much longer than he could have even imagined. It's going to be like 20 years. During his tenure there, Joseph was doing something dangerous. Later during his tenure there, Joseph was out doing something dangerous with a friend of his, and he nearly died. Instead, with a bit of luck, he only bruised his leg, which caused him to stay in Edinburgh longer than he had anticipated, but at least he wasn't dead. His friend would later say how stupid he was at the time because he had almost gotten Joseph Lister killed, and just how much of a loss the world would have had if Joseph had died at that time. We're then introduced to Richard James Mackenzie, who is a 33-year-old battlefield surgeon during the Crimean War against the Russians in 1854. This builds up his credentials, background, and experience before sharing how this provided Joseph with opportunities. Quote, "Those who survived the combat and loss of limbs were not clear of danger just yet. Shortly after the guns fell silent, there was an outbreak of Astriac cholera. It stalked Mackenzie's battalion across water, over hills, and through valleys. It was relentless in its pursuit. Generated by the bacterium Vibrio cholera, this disease is usually transmitted through water supplies contaminated by the feces of the infected. At the time of the Crimean War, the disease was making its way across Europe, and it's possible that the cholera was carried to the front lines in the guts of soldiers. After an inebriated period of 2 to 5 days, a victim will suffer a sudden onset of severe diarrhea and vomiting, giving rise to massive fluid loss and dehydration. Death can follow within hours, as Mackenzie noted in a letter back home. Many were struck down at morning parade and died in 3 or 4 or 5 hours. I needed scarcely say that any treatment in such cases was utterly vain. If left untreated, Asiatic cholera has a 40 to 60% mortality rate. During the 2.5-year conflict, more than 18,000 soldiers would die from the disease, which claimed more lives than any others that plagued the British Army during the Crimean War. Among the first to succumb was Richard James Mackenzie. The promising surgeon from Edinburgh died of cholera 5 days after the Battle of Alma on September 25, 1854. Once again, death had cleared the way for another man's advancement. Joseph wasn't sure what to do with himself, other than he was missing his family and he wanted to go home to London. However, it was hard to find a job in London. Eventually, he continued to work underneath James Syme, who opened his own practice, and he fell in love with Syme's daughter Agnes, saying that she may have not been the most beautiful woman that he's ever seen, but she had a wonderful personality and was incredibly smart. Joseph's father worried about the interest that Joseph had in Agnes because she was not a Quaker and had no interest in becoming one. And obviously, as the faith said, you cannot be with somebody who is outside of the faith. Meanwhile, Joseph was teased by his co-workers for his pursuit. Despite his family's protest, Joseph did pursue his interests in Agnes. They told him that he should willingly relinquish his Quaker membership rather than being disowned by the faith, as it left the door open for him to rejoin if he ever wanted to in the future. But he could not remain a Quaker if he was going to marry outside the faith. Joseph did as his family suggested and forfeited his Quaker membership before proposing to Agnes. After the marriage, he became obsessed with frogs and threw himself into the work of finding out what caused inflammation in surgery and why some wounds became infected and some didn't. He had a home lab where he tried different things with the frogs, dissecting them and taking out their brains and spinal cords and testing different theories until he better understood different types of inflammation and starting to build the basis for his understanding of his work in sepsis. Joseph was then elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society shortly after he was appointed to the faculty of the Royal Infirmary, along with other members like Robert Boyle, Sir Isaac Newton, and Charles Darwin. He continued his studies with a microscope. He continued to study infection and inflammation while also pushing the belief that hospitals weren't just relieving symptoms of patients, but it could also be used to train the next coming doctors on real patients, giving actual experience on what people will see other than, dead bodies. He also stood out among his peers in the hospital for the level of compassion that he brought that was unlike any of the other doctors. Now, as we talked about before, with the clinical coldness that was used, Joseph Lister never adopted that, and instead often brought the compassion that was part of his Quaker upbringing to his patient. Quote, "Like most hospitals in the 1860s, the Royal Infirmary attracted patients who were too poor to pay for private care. Some were uneducated and illiterate. Many doctors and surgeons viewed them as socially inferior and treated them with a clinical detachment that was often dehumanizing. Lister, true to his Quaker roots, exhibited an unusual level of compassion for those on his ward. He refused to use the word case when referring to a specific patient, choosing instead to call them this poor man or this good woman. He also recommended to his students that they use technical words so that nothing was said or suggested that could in any way cause them anxiety or alarm, something that would undoubtedly be viewed as unethical today, but was born purely out of compassion when Lister suggested it." One of his students later recounted a time when Lister admonished an instrument clerk who had brought an uncovered tray full of knives into the operating theater. The seasoned surgeon quickly threw a towel over the tray and said in slow, sorrowful tones, "How can you have such a cruel disregard for this poor woman's feelings? Is it not enough for her to be passing through this ordeal without adding unnecessarily to her suffering by displaying this array of naked steel?" Lister understood that being in a hospital would be a terrifying experience and followed his own golden rule. Every patient, even the most degraded, should be treated with the same care and regard as though they were the Prince of Wales himself. He went above and beyond the call of duty when it came to putting at ease children who were also admitted to the ward. There's a story in here about how a child came in for surgery and that child had a doll that was missing a leg, and he actually sewed the leg back onto the doll to give to the child to help bring the child at ease. In every case that he could, Joseph Lister tried to be patient, understanding, and give as much care as possible, even with patients that were difficult to show patients too. Quote, even in his private practice, he exhibited an acute empathy with his patients that extended to their pockets. Consequently, Lister objected to issuing bills to those whom he treated and lectured his students that they should not charge for their services as a merchant does charge for his goods. Reflecting the ideals of his faith, Lister believed that the greatest reward for a surgeon was the knowledge that he had performed an act of beneficence for the sick. Shall we charge for the blood which is drawn or the pain which we caused? He asked his students. During his time, Joseph was also trying to get cleaner practices going by washing things between uses, believing that there might have been a difference to it, considering the common thought at the time was like, why are we going to wash these items? We're just going to go from one surgery to another. They're just going to get messy immediately again, so we'll just clean it up all after. He was putting basins of cold water out so that he could clean his instruments off and his hands off, thinking that the cold water might cut down on the heat that caused fever and inflammation. Previously, it had been suggested by someone else that it may have been the doctors causing illness and infection to be worse by carrying. Previously, somebody else had suggested that it may have actually been the doctors that had been making infection and illness worse by carrying nastiness between patients. But other doctors got offended at the accusations that they could be carriers of disease and refused to even humor the idea that they may be responsible for their nasty, dirty hands bringing patients suffering. There was also an observation that male doctors had a higher mortality rate for delivering babies than female housewives had. And at first, everybody thought or assumed that it was just because men were more careless in delivering babies. Quote, in 1847, one of his colleagues died after cutting his hand during a post-mortem examination. To his surprise, the Hungarian physician realized that the disease that had killed his friend was identical to the puerperal fever. What if doctors working in the dead house were carrying cadaverous particles with them onto the wards when they assisted in the delivery of babies? And it was this that caused the infection rates to spike. After all, Semmelweis observed, many of these young men went directly from autopsy to attend to a pregnant woman in the hospital. Believing the puerperal fever was caused not by miasma but infectious material from a dead body, Semmelweis set up a basin filled with chlorinated water in the hospital. Those passing from the dissection room to the ward were required to wash their hands before attending to living patients. Mortality rates on the medical students' wards plummeted. In April of 1847, the rate was 18.3%. That means you almost have a 1 in 5% chance of dying from infection. After a hand washing was instituted the following month, rates in June were 2.2%, followed by 1.2% in July and 1.9% in August. So hand washing works. Despite this, Semmelweis's methods were not adopted, and he was actually considered crazy for them. Also because he got personally insulted, and he wrote a book about it, got called insulted, defended his book, and then he was institutionalized. Quote, Semmelweis saved many lives. However, he was not able to convince many physicians of the merits of his belief that incidences of puerperal fever were related to contamination caused through contact with dead bodies. Even those willing to carry out trials of his method often did so inadequately, producing discouraging results. After a number of negative reviews of a book that he published on the subject, Semmelweis lashed out at his critics. His behavior became so erratic and embarrassing to his colleagues that he was eventually confined to a mental institution before he spent his final days raging about child bed fever and the doctors who refused to wash their hands. Can you imagine being that guy that's just like, you need to wash your hands! Wash your hands, you're killing children! And they're like, this guy is nuts. This guy. He's like, wash your hands! Also, can we talk about the ego for a second? That these doctors are like, look, I cannot believe that you were saying that I am spreading disease. I am a doctor. Who cares if I am elbow deep in a rotting corpse with maggots all over it? I am not the spreader of diseases. All right, I just got a knife in my mouth that I used on 16 other patients today, but I am not a spreader of diseases. If it wasn't so tragic, it's comedic, but it is tragic. Now, going back to Joseph, Semmelweis is important, but we just need that to be the first kind of mention of something. Regardless of the changes that Joseph did within his own practice, the attempts to make the place cleaner, none of them worked and patients kept dying. Joseph's mind became consumed with this question of why people seemed to fully recover if they were injured, but skin was not broken. However, if injured with broken skin, sickness was pretty much a given. By the end of 18 1864, his attention was drawn to a French microbiologist named Louis Pasteur, who had helped inspire him in the direction that he needed to go. Now, at this time, the common thought that disease and death and illness traveled in the stink and miasma through the air. However, when the Times was filled with feces because of the overpopulation and the air just stank like a high heaven, people weren't dropping dead as everybody had expected they would because the air was so nasty. Instead, the population was confused. So now the French chemist Louis Pasteur was brought into the world of germs by witnessing food going bad when he left some of them open and others did not go bad when they were closed. He looked at why his wine had gone bad, why some of his milk had gone bad, used a microscope, and he had discovered little microbes that would later be called germs and bacteria. He shared his findings, but they weren't really welcomed by the scientific community, as you would expect. Quote, his experiments established what is now considered one of the cornerstones of biology. Only life begets life. In a speech of his findings delivered to the Sorbonne, Pasteur said, never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of the simple experiment. It wasn't long before the word germ was being used to describe these protein microbes. In an instant, Pasteur went from being a serious chemist held in esteem by most of the scientific community to being considered a maverick by his championing of what he called the world of the infinitely small. His research immediately fell under attack, threatening to topple long-established views of how the world worked. The scientific journal La Presse passed damning judgment on the French scientist, saying, I'm afraid that the experiments you quote, M. Pasteur, will turn against you. The world in which you wish to take us is really too fantastical. So again, we get another example of how bringing forth new ideas, bringing forth something that may be fantastical, that may be not considered the norm, a fresh idea, being straight up rejected. There is zero curiosity, which is also, I would say, where a creative background, not just like creative, but trying different things, not being so stuck in the mud that it is, this is the way that we do it, this is the only way, and thinking that this is all that you can do. Look, you don't get Kojima by going only by the book. You have to allow some level of creativity. Now, you can have rules within creativity, but if you are unwilling to be flexible at all, it's this limiting. Now, threats from colleges didn't detour Monsieur Pasteur. Quote, undeterred, Pasteur began to make connections between fermentation and putrefaction. The application of my ideas are immense, he wrote in 1863. I am ready to approach the great mystery of the putrid disease which constantly occupy my mind. There was good reason for Pasteur to be so preoccupied with the subject of infectious disease. Between 1859 and 1865, 3 of his daughters died of typhoid fever. Pasteur believed that putrefaction, like fermentation, was also caused by the growth of minute microorganisms that were carried through the air by dust. Life directs the work of death at every stage, he wrote. There was just one problem, however. Pasteur was not a physician, a point that he lamented as his research into the matter progressed. How I wish I had the special knowledge that I need to launch myself wholeheartedly into the experimental study of one of the contagious diseases. Fortunately for Pasteur, his work had already begun to attract the attention of a select few within the medical community, like Sir Thomas Spencer Wells, surgeon to Queen Victoria. So while he discovered the microbes and the germs, because he was a chemist, he didn't know how to apply it to bodies, to biology, or what to even look for in the medical field. So they had antiseptics at the time, but they were only used after things had already gotten infected. Pus and inflammation were also considered good signs of healing rather than signs that something was wrong. Because of this, antiseptic didn't really have the best reputation as working, since it was always applied too late and it was not applied when infection was actually present. However, Lister started doing experiments applying antiseptic before infection set in. He didn't get the results that he wanted and soon stopped with his first experiments, but he didn't let this failure stop him from doing further experiments to find what he was looking for. A young boy having an accident with his leg needed it amputated to save his life gave Lister the opportunity that he wanted to test his antiseptic methods on a human. Because the boy was so young, cutting off his leg would surely ruin his future job prospects and doom him to a life of being a second-class citizen who couldn't get a job and was just a beggar. By not cutting off his leg in the moment, there was this risk to his life that the infection would spread throughout his body and kill him, but Joseph Lister wanted to take the chance to cure the infection without cutting the boy's leg off. Imagine getting a scratch that gets infected and they're like, We just have to cut it off. Like, you're gonna just have this huge festering wound instead of this cut, but otherwise you're gonna die. Joseph Lister administered his special treatment of antiseptic, and when the case was successful, he tested using carbolic acid when cleaning other wounds and ended up with a failure rate of only 9%. As his methods gained more confidence, Joseph continued to use them and share them more widely. Quote, throughout the series of articles, he also demonstrated how his system evolved by explaining why he rejected certain types of dressings and why he tried different approaches when others had failed. The unashamedly scientific methods Lister had applied to his experiment was plain for all to see. Also evident was Lister's laudably altruistic purpose in discovering and then advocating his antiseptic methods. Evincing the selflessness inculcated in him by the Quaker upbringing, he wrote, the benefits which attend this practice are so remarkable that I feel it incumbent upon me to do what I can to diffuse them. Anyone seeking physical proof of these benefits could find it on his 2 wards at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. So something else I want to point out here, because it's worth noting, both with Pasteur and with Lister here, is that they are making discoveries for the benefit of mankind. They're not patenting it like some of the others that have tried to, like, oh, my thing is so good. And I've got something in that quackery book that's like people would make their miracle elixirs with drugs in them, with like cocaine and radiation and whatever, and then try to patent it because they so wanted it to be theirs to make the money. But you see people like Joseph Lister, like Pasteur, who are just focused on developing something to give it to mankind, to better mankind, and it's corporations are evil. That's what I'm basically saying here, is corporations are evil. They will try to monetize you being able to be alive and to stop people from making discoveries that better humanity, that better your life, because they want money. Hot take. Not really. I think defending corporations is a bit more of a hot take, to be fair. So Joseph Lister's sister, Isabella, now has come to him in 1867 because she found a lump in her breast. The history of breast cancer treatment goes first to when many patients died from returning from surgery because not enough cancer was actually removed during the surgery because the patients were awake, and so the doctors were like speeding through to scrape as much as they could as fast as they could, and it was never enough. It honestly just sounds horrifying. I would probably choose to die of breast cancer first. Quote, in a letter to her daughter, 60-year-old Lucy Thurston described the horrifying ordeal that she endured during her mastectomy. When the surgeon arrived, he opened his hand to show her his knife. Then came a gash, long and deep, first on one side of my breast and then on the other. Deep sickness seized me and deprived me of my breakfast. This was followed by extreme faintness. My sufferings were no longer local. There was a general feeling of agony throughout the whole system. I felt every inch of me as though flesh was failing. I myself fully intended to have seen this thing done, but on recollection, every glimpse I happened to have was the doctor's right hand completely covered with blood up to the very wrist. He afterwards told me that at the one time the blood from the artery flew into his eye so that he could not see. It was nearly an hour and a half that I was beneath his hand, in cutting out the entire breast, in cutting out the glands beneath the arm, in tying the arteries, in absorbing the blood, in sewing up the wound, and putting on the adhesive plasters, and in applying the bandages. Like, you're just going through torture at this point. This is why people drink themselves to death, because they are signing up for torture in order to avoid death and then dying anyway. It's horrible. I get it was a necessary step, but also, like, I don't think I would take it. Once again, and once anesthesia was involved, things became more dangerous as pain was no longer a threat, and surgeons became a little more blade happy because they weren't dealing with screaming and squirming. Quote, to do this, he suggested that not only the breast, but also the underlying muscles be removed in what is known as an en-bloc mastectomy. This, of course, left the patient vulnerable to infection afterwards, and just cutting off all the muscles as well, since now they're trying to get more of the cancer cells. They're just taking it all out. Despite the warnings Symes gave to Joseph about how difficult the task would be to perform the surgery on his own sister, Joseph loved his sister so much that he didn't want her to suffer. So he performed his first mastectomy on her. He used carbolic acid, and he knew because he knew what other practices in surgery were like, and he believed in his carbolic methods. He wanted to give her the best surgery that could possibly happen, and he believed that it was through him, because of the success of the carbolic acid, that other surgeons were not using. So he performed the surgery, cleaning the tools, keeping the wounds clean, and actually had a very successful removal of the cancer. He took so much care when working on his beloved sister, but he said that the surgery was mentally and emotionally draining beyond anything he ever wished to experience again. Unfortunately, his sister would die after developing liver cancer 3 years later, and there was nothing that could be done about it. But she was breast cancer free. However, Joseph's mastectomy on his sister revolutionized mastectomy surgery, period. Quote, on one day soon, the surgeon would be able to base his decisions to perform mastectomies on prognosis alone, not on whether a patient was at risk of developing postoperative sepsis. Despite the success of the surgery and the use of carbolic acid, there were still many in the science and medical community who did not like or agree with Joseph Lister and decided to fight him on it publicly at every chance they got, deciding that they didn't like it, how it seemed he was taking credit for discovering carbolic acid when he didn't come up with it. Quote, a storm was brewing, however, as the first voices of dissent rose, and the initial resistance to Lister's antiseptic methods had little to do with whether they actually worked. What seemed to be the most contentious issue was that many of his critics mistakenly believed Lister was claiming credit for discovering the antiseptic qualities of carbolic acid, which surgeons on the continent had been using for years. On September 21st, a letter appeared in the Edinburgh Daily Review, signed by Chirurgicus. In it, the author wrote that he feared Lister's recent article on the use of carbolic acid in surgery was calculated to bring down on us some discredited, particularly among our French and German neighbors, in as far as it attributes to the first surgical employment of carbolic acid to Professor Lister. Chirurgicus went on to point out that the French physician and pharmacist Jules Lemaire had written on carbolic acid long before Lister first use of it. I have lying before me a thick volume on the subject, written by Dr. Lemaire of Paris, and the second edition, which was published in 1865. Lemaire had shown carbolic acid's utility in arresting suppuration in surgery and as a dressing to compound fractures and wounds, the author maintained. Ego was so incredibly involved in the fighting off of Lister and what Lister was doing. So just note that it's not just patients or patients' health that anything in the medical apparatus is about, but also reputation and even personal techniques and practice. Because all of these doctors thought that if Lister, well, it's kind of implied, that if Lister was correct, then they are in part to blame for the suffering and death of many patients. Like, think back to also when they were like, I can't possibly be the carrier of disease. How dare you? Because then they are failing at their supposed duties. Quote, although it had been written under a pseudonym, everyone knew Chirurgicus's letter had been penned by the influential doctor who had discovered chloroform, James Y. Simpson. The renowned obstetrician had enthusiastically distributed the text to people in the medical community, including the letter of the Lancet, James G. Wakely. A week later, the letter appeared in a journal with an accompanying note from Wakely. To Professor Lister is due the credit of having made the agent extensively known in this country. With these words, the world's leading medical journal had made it seem as if Lister's only accomplishment had been to replicate a continental practice in Britain, when in fact he was proposing a revolutionary approach to wound management based on the scientific theory. Simpson had his own motivations for wishing to minimize the significance of Lister's antiseptic treatment. The truth was that if Lister's methods worked, they would come in direct conflict with Simpson's technique of acupressure, which was aimed at promoting healing without suppuration. Simpson could not let that light go. The obstetrician even sent Lister a copy of his pamphlet on the technique with a covering letter criticizing the profession's strange and inexplicable use of ligatures that seditiously and systematically implanted dead and decomposing arterial tissue in every large wound. He obsessed over the fact that so few surgeons had adopted his technique. An early biographer said that Simpson was jealous of everything that challenged acupressure, nothing he thought should be tolerated, whose tendency was to continue the use of the ligatures in amputations, after the superiority of acupressure had, as he believed, been established. Lister found himself once more locking horns with the bull-headed Simpson several weeks after the original attack appeared in the Edinburgh Daily Review. Lister responded to Chirurgicus in the Lancet. He admitted that he had never read Lemire's book, but claimed that this was hardly surprising because the French surgeon works does not appear to have attracted the attention of our profession. He went on to defend his own system, saying that the visitors to Glasgow, who had seen his antiseptic treatments firsthand, had not questioned its originality. The novelty, he wrote, was not the surgical use of the carbolic acid, which I never claimed, but the methods of its employment with the view of protecting the reparatory processes from disturbances by external agents. Lister ended his response with a gibe at the author, trusting that such unworthy cavils will not impede the adoption of a useful procedure. I am, sir, yours. Simpson literally just kept insulting Lister in paper after paper and letter after letter to the magazines in the professional settings, trying to bait him into a slap fight. But Joseph Lister stayed focused and hoped that his work and the application of his work would speak for itself. He didn't much like the drama, and it actually started weighing on him that Simpson was doing this to him. Quote, although publicly Lister maintained a dignified silence, privately he felt wounded by the attacks. In a letter to Joseph Jackson, he wrote, I have always felt that the editors of these medical journals to take no notice at all of any articles that I might write was the best that could happen, so that the good, if there were any, in my work might quietly produce in its effect in improving the knowledge and treatment of disease. He added mournfully, fame is no plant that grows on mortal soil. Lister's nephew said of his uncle that he found Simpson's attacks repugnant and distressing. The quiet, reserved surgeon, who once thought the Scottish cities would suit his temperament better than London because there were fewer professional quarrels, was beginning to realize how difficult the task would be. He would need more of a testimony of a few medical students to encourage surgeons to take the antiseptic treatment seriously. So it's just like squabbles and drama and trying to drag people has always been a human professional pastime in every single field, everywhere. So at least I hope that makes some people feel maybe more comforted that, it's a thing. And the best you can do is just keep going. I constantly see new stuff every so often come up with new drama in the writing community. And I'm just like, just keep on doing your thing. Be the best writer you can be. Focus on writing, learning your skill, learning your craft, seeing what other people are doing, and screw drama. Who cares? I'm a storyteller. I'm trying to connect to people through the stories. That's all. Meanwhile, there are many of his peers in the medical community that did not take his practices with carbolic acid seriously, as they saw him doing some defunct method of old that was just garbage. Quote, many opponents likened Lister's antiseptic systems to the traditional practice of putting ointments on putrefactive wounds and hoping for the best, like those practitioners who had been using wine, quinine, and Condi fluids for decades. A young physician from Liverpool named Frederick W. Ricketts sided with Simpson, arguing that acupressure was simple, effectual, and elegant, while Lister's methods were obsolete and inelegant. In a similar way, James Morton, a physician who had worked with Lister at the Royal Infirmary until his tenure ended in October 1867, concluded that carbolic acid was certainly not superior, barely equal to some of the other antiseptics in common use. Can we just recognize that there was and maybe still nothing elegant about surgery, but especially at this time, it's literally just hacking people open in a bloody mess and was previously done while people were screaming and awake and flailing. It was literally live butchery. Like, that's why it didn't have any respect. Another hurdle for many doctors was the acceptance of germ theory. Quote, while the older generations of surgeons were willing to try his antiseptic treatment on patients, they struggled to accept germ theory of putrefaction, which was at the heart of his system. If surgeons continued to misunderstand the cause of infection, they were unlikely to apply the treatment correctly. In the midst of his debate, Lister presented an address to the medico-chirurgical Society of Glasgow, in which he emphasized that efforts in employing the antiseptic treatment should be directed on principles, namely Louis Pasteur's. Lister's colleague, Morton, didn't find fault with this method. He also didn't accept the premise that germs were to blame for the putrefaction. Morton characterized Lister's published research as fear-mongering. Nature is here regarded as some murderous hag, he wrote, whose fiendish machinations must be counteracted. She must be entrapped into good behavior. She is no longer to be trusted. Even the editor at the Lancet refused to use the word germs, instead calling them septic elements contained in the air. It was difficult for many surgeons at the height of their careers to face the fact that for the past 15 or 20 years, they might have been inadvertently killing patients by allowing the wounds to become infected with tiny, invisible creatures. Look, I understand that that's one way to cope. It's like a cognitive dissonance of a sort, because you don't want to think about like all of the pain and death that you've actually caused, both physical and emotional death. But also, you can't blame yourself for doing something when you don't know what you don't know. And if you didn't know that germs existed, you didn't know if this caused it, like there's nothing that you could have done. The worst thing that you could do is when you're given new information. Like it's fine to not just accept new information wholesale at like right up front. Keep testing it until you get further proof. But it does not help to just wholesale reject what you're seeing and just no, I'm not guilty, no. Many argued that it wasn't preventative, but could help once infection already set in, so they refused to do it as Lister said. Others argued that it wasn't practical when at the time surgeons focused on speed and practicality over exactitude because Lister's methods required exactitude, care, not being messy, and that was ultimately the biggest struggle against using the method. No matter how much Lister spoke on or showed how it worked, so long as other surgeons were applying it haphazardly, it was not going to produce the results that Lister was having, and they were going to continue to say that it was bunk. Quote, this time around, Paget claimed that he followed each step carefully, if not with all of the skill that Professor Lister would employ it, yet with more than is ever likely to be gradually used in the treatment of fractures. Lister's antiseptic treatments certainly did no good in Paget's opinion. Given his prominence in the medical community, Paget's testimony was damning. It wasn't a surprise that the greatest resistance to Lister's antiseptic treatment had come from the capital. As verdict after verdict against Lister rolled in, the editor of the Lancet wondered why London seemed to be especially resistant to his methods. Are the conditions of suppuration different here from those in Glasgow? He asked facetiously. Or is it that the antiseptic treatment is not tried with that care without which Mr. Lister has always pointed out it does not succeed? As long as others are applying his methods shoddily or half-heartedly, winning the hearts and minds would prove next to impossible. Lister needed to go with a more practical approach. This is like a 20-year period, you guys. People continue to fight with Joseph over whether his methods made a difference. Mortality rates among those who went through surgery went up again, and the medical community used this as an excuse to say that Joseph's ideas were bunk and that it was a fluke that he was having better luck with his methods. Meanwhile, Joseph knew people were only half-heartedly applying his methods, but he also wanted to isolate the reason why mortality rates went on the rise again. That's what he was concerned about, was people dying, and he's like, why is this happening? Honestly, his sense of curiosity and his care for people are really something special and inspiring to me, and especially in the face of the Royal Infirmary staff and management and the people in London all wanting to fight with him for years over how legitimate he was. As the hospital accused him of being bogus in his claims because look at the people dying, he responded by saying, look at the conditions of the hospital. Of course, hospital management was pissed at him, being like, you want to blame me? Look at this. Look at this trash. Look at this garbage. Look at this vile mess of gross. Quote, I engaged in a perpetual contest with the managing body, who, anxious to provide hospital accommodations for the increasing population of Glasgow, were disposed to introduce additional beds. Although the manager had removed a high wall on the wards to improve air circulation, this had occurred after he had been treating patients with carbolic acid for 9 months. Therefore, Lister believed that this could not have accounted for the decline in mortality rates on the ward. As to those people who attributed this success to improved diets and increased rations of his wards, Lister wrote that the idea that diet alone could abolish pemia, erysipelas, and hospital gangrene would hardly enter the minds of an intelligent medical man. Lister's remarks about the state of Glasgow's Royal Infirmary did not go unnoticed by the hospital's managers, many of whom already many of whom already harbored disdain for the trailblazing surgeon. Henry Lamond, secretary to the directors, was quick to respond, writing to the editor of The Lancet. Lamond said that Lister's accusations, so far as they relate to the alleged unhealthiness and the conditions of the hospital, are unfair and not supported by facts. The administrators believed that Lister's antiseptic treatment had contributed very little to the declining mortality rates of the hospital in recent years. Instead, they maintained that the improved health and satisfactory conditions of the hospital, which had been as marked in the medical as the surgical department, is mainly attributable to the better ventilation, the improved dietary, and the excellent nursing to which the directors had given so much attention in later years. They're like, excuse me, sir. It's because we're feeding them differently that things are better. And Lister's like, y'all are just dumb. You saying this, no smart person would say this, which when you start getting into insults, like, and I try to say this when stuff breaks out other places, and I try to not necessarily insult people the best that I can if I disagree with them. But as soon as you start getting into insults, anything that you say is just, it's not going to matter, because you have to approach with respect, minimal respect. Even if you don't like somebody, don't roll your eyes. If you want to be taken seriously, being frustrated is understandable, but know that if you act out of frustration, you're not going to change the minds of whoever you think it is you're arguing with. And you may not change the minds of the audience if there's an audience. At this point, James Simpson was still sitting here being the peanut gallery of hate. Quote, "This speculation of organic germs is, I fear, far more than an innocent fallacy," he told the conference attendees, among them James Y. Simpson. "It is a positive injury," he continued, "for teaching that those desperate consequences which so often follow wounds result from one cause alone and are to be prevented by attending to it alone, leads to the ignoring of those many and often complicated causes." In his response to Nunnally, Lister could barely disguise his disgust that he should dogmatically oppose the treatment which he so little understands, and which, by his own admission, has never actually tried, is a matter of small moment. Sensing his son's growing frustration over the attacks, Joseph Jackson, who is his father, sought to comfort him. In a letter he wrote, "However slowly and imperfectly the improvements suggested by thee may be adopted, and however thy claims may be slighted or disputed, it is a great thing to have been permitted to be at the means of introducing so great a blessing as the antiseptic treatment to thy fellow mortal." Now, if you're wondering why he says thy and thee, it's a Quaker thing. During all of this, he also heard through letters from his brother that their father wasn't doing so well. Joseph rushed home to London to see the father, and just days later, his father died. Joseph took this loss very hard because of how much he loved his father, appreciated his father, and constantly went to his father for counsel whenever he needed encouragement and guidance. His father had always been there for him. Within the same year as Joseph's father died, his father-in-law and his mentor for medical school, James Syme, also died. Side note, James Syme had been called the Napoleon of surgery. Meanwhile, amidst all of this grief and loss that Joseph was going through, he was still trying to get through to the medical community about his findings. He didn't let his pain or his personal problems stop him. Quote, "So far as the medical community seemed reluctant to accept the idea that microscopic organisms cause a disease. As one of Lister's assistants astutely observed, a new and great scientific discovery is always apt to leave in its wake many casualties among the reputations of those who have been champions of an older method. It is hard for them to forgive the man whose work has rendered their own of no account. If it was difficult for the older surgeon to unlearn decades of orthodoxy, Lister reasoned that it would be a lot easier to convert the incoming students to the theories and methods. As he was instituting his methods, he also instituted requirements to make sure that his students were actually showing up for class, because many of them would skip and then still pass medical school. But he's like, if you want to be a medical student, if you want to be a surgeon, you need to show up for class." Quote, "Lister's students expected a lot from their instructor, and he in turn expected much from them. He managed his classroom like a policeman. As was customary during the time, students presented tickets inscribed with their names when they attended lectures. This allowed an instructor to note absentees. Using this system, Lister banned those who habitually missed his classes. He collected admission tickets personally at the door as the younger men filed into the inner sanctum. This was to ensure that students didn't submit 2 cards on behalf of an absentee absent friend, a common practice that Lister abhorred. Anything that leads a man to think that it is a matter of indifference whether he writes or tells a lie is more pernicious, Lister wrote. He comes to write lies afterwards with the same indifference. He also monitored access to the classroom so that students couldn't interrupt him with tardy arrivals. I have all of the entrances or exits so arranged that nobody can come into the classroom after a certain time, he wrote, and the students can only go out by a single door. Much like how Joseph was in the operating room, he was also different from other instructors when he was with his students. Quote, many professors at the University of Edinburgh were known to lose their tempers and storm out of the class when they couldn't control their unruly pupils. But Lister commanded an audience in a way that his colleagues did not. His classroom was a revered place where people could come to worship science. As one of his former students said, a pin drop could be heard in his presence. He riveted attention and cast a spell of serious and earnestness all over. Only once the spell was broken, the young man joked in sonorous and clerical tones about Lister's antiseptic treatment. Lister raised his eyes to the joker and shot him a sad and pitying glance. The effect was magical, said the same student, who noted that a year later the heckler in question died of general paralysis. He knew nothing than the syropchets, the bacteria reasonable for syphilis, and it was playfully suggested that Jove had smitten him with sacrilege. Joseph Lister's approach in showing his new medical students his methods and why they worked via practical application worked to spread them because the students, one, didn't have the baggage of their pride of what they had been doing or the fear that they were going to look like failures for all of the deaths that they had on their shoulders, but also because the students were actively seeing the methods and they were seeing it work fantastically. Quote, his reports in the Lancet might not have been enough to convince some surgeons of the validity of the germ theory, but his students saw with their own eyes the antiseptic system working every time they accompanied him into the wards. If seeing was believing, Lister was creating a group of disciples, men who would graduate and spread his ideas beyond the narrow confines of the university. His followers, who later became known as Listerians, soon came to dominate the institutes and ideology of British surgery, spreading the doctrine of antisepsis with a reverential devotion. Not only that, but the way that Joseph Lister went about surgery and teaching with his attention to care and curiosity inspired a new approach in his students as well. Quote, the announcement of Lister's antiseptic systems in 1867 was just the beginning of his work on petrifactive wounds. He continued to experiment with carbolic acid, which involved fine-tuning and making adjustments in his methods. Indeed, Lister's students who might attend a demonstration with their minds settled on one technique, only to discover that their professor had already developed a new method since their last encounter. They all came to expect these changes. From them, it underlined the value of experimentation in medicine and illustrated that observational acuity and accuracy could lead to improvements in surgery. So rather than leaving stuff as being the precedence of this is what we've always done, Lister brought the scientific method to advancing medicine where it hadn't been there before. Then in his attempt to continue to minimize infection in patients because he'd gotten his carbolic acid and antiseptic where he wanted it, Joseph Lister wanted to discover a different way to close ligatures that wasn't tying internal parts on the outside to be closed later when the wound had healed. Because by having those internal parts outside, it gave basically a highway for germs to get into the inside, and he was like, there has to be something else. This is when he started trying silk and organ grafts from animals to use as stitching so that they could be absorbed into the body and healed as the body. He discovered that dead organic materials, such as organs from animals, could successfully be absorbed into the living, and as he experimented, he shared his findings. His changing opinions were seen as failures, though, by freaking peanut gallery haters like Simpson. Quote, as Lister's methods evolved, skeptics characterized these constant modifications as admissions on his part that the original system did not work. They didn't see the adjustments as part of the natural progression of a scientific process. James Y. Simpson waded into the controversy, suggesting an almost fatalistic approach to the problem of plaguing the country's hospitals. If cross-contamination could not be controlled, he argued, then hospitals could be periodically destroyed and built anew. Even Lister's old instructor, John Erickson, adopted this view. Once a hospital has become incurably pymia-stricken, it is impossible to disinfect it by known hygienic means, as it would be to disinfect an old cheese of the maggots which had been generated in it, he wrote. There was only one solution in Erickson's mind, and it wasn't his former pupil's antiseptic system. he advocated the wholesale demolition of the infected fabric. So rather than freaking just trying Lister's methods earnestly, they're like, burn it all down. Just burn it all down. That is some spite and ego right there. Okay, whatever. Meanwhile, as London and Scotland are doing this, other countries were actually calling on Lister to understand his methods, to come and visit them in other countries, to teach them about his antiseptic, and he was held in high regards. Quote, but for all of the opposition Lister faced, he was fighting the battle with like-minded people who recognized the revolutionary nature of his work. Initially, his antiseptic systems received more support in the continent than it did in Britain, so much so that in 1870, Lister was asked by both the French and the Germans to furnish some guidelines for treating wounded soldiers fighting in the Franco-Prussian War. As a consequence, the Russian physician Richard von Volkmann became a spirited devotee after his hospital at Halle, overcrowded with wounded soldiers from the war and so dreadfully overcome by the infection that the closures was imminent, achieved astonishing results by employing Lister's methods. Following this, Lister's system was taken up by other European surgeons, including a Dane named M.H. Saxtorph, who reported success in a letter to Lister. Armed with this testimony, Lister goaded the surgeons in London, who had been the most critical of his antiseptic treatment. It may seem strange that the results like these should have to be obtained in Copenhagen, when so little approach to them has yet even been made in the capital of England. Because of the outward support that he had gotten, some of the surgeons in his own country finally started to defend him. Quote, one of these men was Thomas Keith, a pioneer in ovariectomy, which was a dangerous procedure that involved the excision of ovarian tumors with the abdominal cavity. For most of the 19th century, ovariectomy remained extremely controversial. Those who dared to undertake such an invasive procedure were nicknamed belly rippers on account of the long incisions that were made across the abdomen of their patients, which frequently became a source of sepsis. Keith defended Lister against earlier attacks by Donald Campbell Black, who had not only dismissed Lister's work as the latest toy in the medical sciences, but also invoked Keith's name in his criticism of the antiseptic system. Keith replied to Black in the British Medical Journal, contrary to what Black had implied, Keith had been dressing wounds exactly as I had seen Mr. Lister do, and with great success. He was dismayed by the fact that Black himself, a surgeon from Glasgow, would attack a colleague when Lister had raised the reputation of the medical school in the city and given it a name. In his opinion, the antiseptic system was the future. I think that I am only now beginning to realize that what Mr. Lister's antiseptic method and his carbolized animal ligatures are yet to do to surgery. E.R. Bickersteth, a surgeon at the Royal Infirmary in Liverpool, also reported numerous cases in which he had effectively employed antiseptic cat-gut ligatures. He considered the antiseptic method an immense step toward the perfection of our art. So this is taking it literally from butchering to an art form to a medical field because of Lister, and people are rejecting it because it's the new thing, because it makes them look bad. Other countries are taking it, and not a bunch of people in the UK and Scotland. Joseph Lister also responded already to the criticisms of his methods by showing the difference of his patients for amputation survival rate. The different rates astonished the community, and now in 1870, London was like, all right, let's try this for real, wholeheartedly, not halfway. Now, a recently qualified surgeon, John Rudd Leeson, came to see Joseph Lister to ask for a position as a dresser underneath him, because John Rudd Leeson was basically a fan. He also, when Leeson came to see Joseph at his house, he described him as, quote, Lister stood up from behind his desk to greet Leeson, who felt instinctively that I was in the presence of the embodiment of high purpose. It is insane to think of people that just like have that air, and they are doing that thing, because other people have said similar. And it's like when we were talking about Elizabeth Packard, everybody talked about like how likable she was, how friendly she was, the kind of energy that she had that just inspired people. And it was one of the reasons why when she was institutionalized, they had to constantly change out the nurses that were around her, because as much as McFarland was trying to have a case against her, she was just befriending everybody that was around her. And they were like, she's not crazy. Why the frick is she here? What is wrong with people? When you meet somebody with that kind of charisma, it's crazy. Now, after a short discussion with Joseph, he gave Liston the position as the dresser and added him to his ledgers. When Liston looked about the house, trying to find other things to talk to the man about because he wanted to leave a good impression, he saw all of the test tubes in Lister's house. Lister became animated, talking excitedly about his experiments because he was so passionate about it. He loved his work. Liston tried not to show that he had no idea what Lister was talking about because it was all above what he understood. Finally, Liston mentioned the microscope sitting on the desk, and that got Joseph even more excited to talk about the importance of microscopes in the future of surgery. And Liston said, quote, "I had not the least idea that the microscope had any connection with the plugged test tubes." Liston later admitted, although he had spent 2.5 years at the London's largest and most progressive hospitals, the newly qualified surgeon said that he had never heard anything about microbes, and certainly had not the slightest idea that they had a connection with medicine or surgery. The role of scientific knowledge and methodology in medical practices, which was central to the transition of the profession from a butchering art to a forward-looking discipline, had not yet been established. But the tide was turning in Lister's favor. Now, things really took a turn when Joseph Lister was invited to perform a surgery on an orange-sized abscess that Queen Victoria had at the time. She was desperate because she was in so much pain, and she didn't want to call a doctor because doctors were scary at the time. Remember what their reputation was? But the pain was so great, and one of her guards actually suggested Joseph Lister to her specifically, and she finally agreed. The surgery was a complete success. There was no pain, there was no infection, there was no nothing. And Queen Victoria made a full recovery. He returned home with the claim now that he is the only man to have ever stuck a knife in Queen Victoria. And fortunately, the success of this procedure, of this huge moment in Lister's life, could not be dampened by lifetime hater James Simpson, because lifetime hater James Simpson had actually died recently of a heart attack. So there would be no comment from the peanut gallery. Now, this success and notoriety with Queen Victoria had actually caused Lister's methods to spread even more widely and be adapted appropriately. Finally, the results showed, though it would still be another decade before it was truly accepted because of the stubbornness and rejection and understanding of science in the medical field at the time. Quote, "The truth is that this is a question in science rather than in surgery, and hence will eagerly be adopted by the scientific Germans and a little grudgingly by the semi-scientific Scot. The antiseptic doctrine has never been in any degree appreciated or understood by the plodding and practical English surgeon. Happily for his patients, he was for a long time been considerable extent practicing a partially antiseptic system thanks to his cleanly English instincts, but it has been like the lady who talked prose without knowing it." Meanwhile, Lister had actually contacted the chemist Pasteur, the French chemist Louis Pasteur, to thank him for the discoveries that he made in germs, which had led to Lister's own advancements in the medical practices, because he had discovered Pasteur's discoveries and then had applied that to trying to understand infection, and it had actually worked. So he sent him a letter. Likewise, Pasteur knew of Lister and was incredibly impressed by the way that Lister had been able to apply the advancement theories, the germ theories, and especially the research that had been done while tending to his own patients. He's like, bruh, you are crazy with your time. You are able to take care of patients, to do your own experiments, to advance surgery. How do you do it all? And you have a family? While Lister's methods were spreading successfully throughout Europe in the 1870s, America was actually not yet adopting those, but marked the antiseptic method as a piece of quackery. Lister knew that he was going to need to go to America in order to defend his methods personally, and this would be done when he visited the International Medical Congress in Philadelphia upon invitation in 1876. At this point, with all that Lister had gone through, he was like, all right, who's next? I know I can defend this. I know my method. I got this. So who wants to challenge me? Because I'm going to prove that I'm right. Now, this event in Philadelphia, it was big. Quote, "It had been 100 years since the Declaration of Independence had been signed in Philadelphia, and the city was bursting with patriotic pride in celebration of the centenary. The Centennial Exhibition was designed to mark America's ascendancy as a leader in science and industry. In an era of large-scale fairs celebrating science and progress, the gathering in Philadelphia was even grander than London's Great Exhibition of 1851, which Lister visited with his father. It featured 30,000 displays from 37 nations of the the world spread over the impressive 450 acres of land. Zigzagging through the fairgrounds was 8 miles of asphalt, bubbling and melting in its relenting heat. The world's first monorail shuttered passengers the 150 yards between Horticulture Hall and Agriculture Hall. Sightseers gawped at the astonishing collection of exotic animals, including a 15-foot walrus, a polar bear, and a shark, all displayed alongside the weapons used to hunt them. The focal point of the fair was the Machinery Hall, where visitors could marvel at the engineering wonders of the age. Electrical lights and elevators were powered by a 1,400 horsepower Corliss steam engine, the largest ever of its kind, weighing in at 650 tons. There were locomotives, fire trucks, printing presses, hulks of mining equipment, and magic lanterns. Recent innovations, such as the typewriter, mechanical calculator, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, were debuted to the appreciative public. By September, the exhibition was averaging an astonishing 100,000 visitors a day, but the British surgeon who had traveled over 4,000 miles of ocean to America had only one aim in his mind: to prove the merits of the antiseptic system. As Lister picked his way through the crowds, he braced himself for what might be awaiting him at the International Medical Congress. So he's a man on a mission, and his mission is to make sure that people get the care that they need to survive, which is really honorable if you ask me. His biggest critique in the US was a man named Dr. Gross of the Gross Clinic. I'm not joking. The universe has a sense of humor and an irony, okay? Quote, Lister's invitation to speak at the conference had come from one of his most vocal critics across the Atlantic. Samuel D. Gross was one of the country's preeminent surgeons and was also a non-believer in the existence of germs. The American surgeon was so set against Lister's antiseptic system that he had commissioned a painting a year earlier to celebrate his faith in the surgical status quo. In the portrait of Samuel D. Gross, later known as the Gross Clinic, the artist Thomas Eakins depicted a dark and dingy operating theater. Gross, at the center of the scene, is operating on a boy who is suffering from osteomyelitis of the femur. The surgeon is surrounded by his assistants, one of whom probes the patient's wound with a bloodied finger. In the foreground, unsterilized instruments and bandages are displayed within reach of equally unclean hands. There is no sign of Lister's antiseptic methods are being used. Imagine being the person that commissions this and you're like, look at this grotesque surgery scene where it is disgusting and we are poking and prodding this bleeding little boy. This is an accomplishment that I am proud of. Are you mad? Who wants to be in filth? Like, even before you accept the germ theory, who wants to look like a horror show, unless you're on a set for a horror show, is like, great. So Dr. Gross was threatened. Not only did Dr. Gross not believe in Lister's methods, but he had threatened anyone who used Lister's hocus pocus around him that they would no longer have a job. It was just around this time that the Civil War had claimed many lives and that there weren't even established doctors or surgeons yet, like there had been in Europe. But the benefit, because they had the hospital schools and hospital colleges and all that. But the United States was so young that it didn't have that yet. However, what the Civil War actually did do was expedite what knowledge people realized they needed in order to create medicine. And so then it helped them establish their medical apparatus fairly quickly because of all of the disaster. But also, that probably contributed to how many deaths were in the Civil War because there was no medical apparatus and there was no acceptance of antiseptics. So not a great situation. They were shoving wounds full of dirt as a way to stop bleeding. I mean, it's a method. Now, Lister didn't get to talk about his methods or himself the first day that he was there. He just had to sit there and listen to person after person after person tell him that his methods sucked and he was... But the next day, the second day at the fair, he was able to give his own speech. It was a 2-hour speech with examples, live examples, and stories about how his method worked. But no matter what he said, the attendees were unimpressed with him. Quote, one attendee accused him of being mentally unhinged and having a grasshopper in the head. Others berated him for speaking so long. The hour being late, one critic whined. I merely desire to point out a few facts which militate against the germ theory as far as it claims that certain class of minute living organisms are essential to the disease process. But it was Samuel Gross, the man who had hoped to discredit Lister by inviting him to speak at the International Medical Congress, who would have the final word, saying, little, if any, faith is placed by any enlightened or experienced surgeon on this side of the Atlantic in the so-called treatment of Professor Lister. Imagine being that guy. When talking to other veteran doctors didn't work, Lister employed the same method that he did in his own country, which was he was touring around talking to medical students about his methods and applying those medical methods for them to see, in which they would then become believers because they saw them in action. How could they not believe? Now, while everybody at the convention, at the conference, were outspoken about their disagreement with Lister, there were many who were quiet supporters who reached out to him after the fact and invited them to come to their schools in order to teach the methods, because they did believe in the methods. They just didn't want to disagree publicly with common issue, to not butt heads with the establishment. Quote, toward the end of his trip, Lister performed an operation on Blackwell's Island, now Roosevelt Island in New York City. He had come at the request of William von Buren, a distinguished surgeon who had heard Lister speak in Philadelphia. It turned out that there were a few attendees who privately supported Lister. For instance, William W. Keene, a pioneer of neurological surgery, adopted antisepsis a month after the International Medical Congress. He later recounted, "For me, it changed surgery from purgatory to paradise," adding that he would never abandon Lister's system. D. Hayes Agnew also adopted Lister's technique as well. Shortly afterward, he highlighted the subject in his book, The Principles and Practices of Surgery. And then there was Van Buren, who was so impressed by Lister's lecture that he was invited to perform a surgical demonstration for his students. On the appointed day, Lister watched in amazement as more than 100 of Van Buren's students filed into the auditorium at Charity Hospital. "I had no idea that I was to address so large a body of students," Lister said to the crowd. "It is a most unexpected privilege." On top of all of that, his strongest believers were also his patients who had lived and been saved by his methods. Some of them were offering him places to stay in America because they had moved after they survived surgery. After all of this, Lister was also invited to speak in a Boston University by Henry J. Bigelow, a man who had banned antiseptic techniques from his Massachusetts General Hospital. However, his attitude soon changed after meeting Lister. Quote, Bigelow invited Lister to speak at Harvard University, where he was warmly received by the medical students in attendance. Not long after, the American surgeon delivered a lecture of his own. In it, he praised the new doctrine and confessed his conversion to Lister's antiseptic system. "I have learned that the duty of the surgeon should be to destroy the actual intruder, germs, and effectually to exclude their thronging companion." With Bigelow's endorsement, Massachusetts General became the first hospital in America to make institutional use of carbolic acid as a surgical antiseptic. It was an extraordinary volte-face of policy in the hospital that for years had banned Lister's methods and even threatened to fire those who dared to implement them. When he returned to the UK, King's College made a formal request to hire Lister for a professor of clinical surgery. His students in Edinburgh were devastated and pleaded with him to stay with them. As much as Lister had come to love Scotland and had spent the better part of his career there, and he met his mentor who turned into his father-in-law there. He met his wife there and spent so much of his life wanting to return to London as that was his home. Now, at the height of his career, he wished to stay because Scotland had become his home. But he knew that he needed to convince the stubborn medical community in London of the success of his system for the better of the people, of the citizens that lived in London. In 1877, Lister slipped quietly away from the Scottish city where he had fallen in love with the bloodied and butchered art of surgery under the tutelage of a great mentor, James Syme. But just before boarding the train, he made a valedictory check upon the final intake of patients at the Royal Infirmary. As he walked the hallways one last time, he took stock of the Institute's marked transformation. He was confident that it would be safe in the hands of his disciples, who would now be entrusted with implementing his antiseptic system throughout the hospital. Gone were the filthy wards crammed with patients wasting away in squalid conditions. Gone were the bloodied aprons and the operating tables soiled with bodily fluids. And gone were the unwashed instruments, all of which once had the operating theater reeking of good old hospital stink. The Royal Infirmary was now bright, clean, and well ventilated. No longer a house of death, it was a house of healing. Oh my gosh, what an image, right? What a life, what an impact. To take it from a butchery house that smelled of corpses with just maggots to the point that people were not even questioning maggots and the growth of mushrooms to being the clean apparatus that it was. And he inspired that despite people telling him that he was nuts, that he needed to shut the frick up, to having haters his entire life. Incredible. Now we reach the epilogue, and it is Louis Pasteur's 70th birthday. Both men are high in their age, having health struggles of their own, and soon, even after this, Lister's wife will pass away. However, at this historic event, the 70th birthday, are respected individuals and dignitaries, and it is used to celebrate the incredible life that was Pasteur's life and the friendship that was between Lister and Pasteur. Lister goes up to give a speech about how wonderful a man he believed Pasteur was, and Pasteur is not able to respond to it after having an incredible stroke that made him unable to talk. But still, Lister paid tribute, quote, to the French scientist during the address. In his typical humble way, he downplayed his own role in the transformation of surgery. Instead, Lister credited Pasteur with raising the dark curtain in medicine. You have changed surgery from being a hazardous lottery into a safe and soundly based science, he said to Pasteur. You are the leader of modern generation of scientific surgeons, and every wise and good man in our profession, especially in Scotland, looks up to you with the respect and attachment as few men receive. If the stroke hadn't severely hindered his ability to speak, Pasteur might have expressed exactly the same sentiment about Lister. The auditorium erupted into thunderous applause as Lister concluded his tribute. Pasteur rose from his chair with the help of an attendant and embraced his old friend. According to an official record on the occasion, it was like a living picture of brotherhood of science in the relief of humanity. The two would never meet again in person. Lister received many accolades, awards, and promotions in the decades following his advancements in the surgical field. Some of the people who were then inspired by him were the brothers who came together to create the company Johnson & Johnson, and they were the first to make antiseptic bandages. You also had the man who behind Listerine, the mouthwash, which was also an antiseptic for other things, who had been at Lister's speech that day at the medical conference and went on to make Listerine and sell that in the United States. And then you also had, in case you were wondering, Pasteur, Louis Pasteur, is the reason for the word pasteurize. It was inspired by him and what he did with germs. Students then came from all over the world to study under Joseph Lister and to take his teaching techniques back with them to their other countries. He changed the face of medicine and in his advancements marked the moment in time where medicine and science finally united. Quote, the adoption of Lister's antiseptic systems was the most prominent outward sign of the medical community's acceptance of germ theory, and it marked the epochal moment when medicine and science merged. Thomas Ekin, the artist who painted the Gross Clinic, returned to the subject in 1889 to paint the Agni Clinic. This time, however, instead of painting a dingy operating theater with surgeons caked in blood, Eakins showed the viewer a markedly cleaner, brighter operating environment with participants wearing stark white coats. The Agni Clinic portrays the embodiment of antisepsis and hygiene. It is Listerianism triumphant. Lister recognized the importance of the hospital, but only in relation to the care and treatment of the poor. His former student, Guy Theodore Wrench, later argued that had it not been for his mentor's work, hospitals might have ceased to exist altogether. Large hospitals were being abandoned and hut hospitals substituted, Wrench wrote. Lister's work came in the nick of time. It saved not only patients but hospitals. It prevented an entire reversion of the method of dealing surgically with the poor. But as essential as hospitals were, Lister did not think that the whole profession would be or should be based on them. Those with means, he believed, would continue to be treated outside of institutional walls, in their homes and in their private clinic. Lister wished for all of his personal stories and writings to be burned and to let the story of his life be spoken through his accomplishments. He didn't want his personal story or anything about him to be shared with the world, only to be known by his accomplishments. And so when he passed, that was his wish. However, quote, Lister wrongly believed that his personal stories had little bearing on the scientific and surgical advancements. Ideas are never created in a vacuum, and Lister's life very much attests to that truth. From the moment that he looked through the lens of his father's microscope to the day that he was knighted by Queen Victoria, his life was shaped and influenced by his circumstances and the people around him. Like all of us, he saw his world through a prism of opinions held by those whom he admired most. Joseph Jackson, a supportive father and accomplished microscopist. William Sharpie, his instructor at UCL, who encouraged him to go to Edinburgh. James Syme, a longtime mentor and father-in-law. Louis Pasteur, the scientist who gave him the needed key to unlock the great medical mysteries of the 19th century. After his death, all of his wishes were carried out, except for that his private and family correspondences were not destroyed, but preserved by his nephew. It is through his writings that we are first allowed to glimpse into Lister's inner sanctum. Hector Cameron, Lister's former student and assistant, later said of him, "We knew that we were in contact with genius. We felt that we were helping in the making of history and that all things were becoming anew. What was once impossible was now achievable, and what was once inconceivable could now be imagined. The future of medicine suddenly seemed limitless." So that is the story of Joseph Lister. And I hope that it's inspiring in a couple of ways. The perseverance that he had, the belief that he had, that he followed his passion, and that he obviously was not without being depressed, without being discouraged. And also, I think specifically with this last bit, talking about seeing who people are, seeing what makes who we are, seeing that nothing comes in a vacuum. Your work is not just your work. Your work is an accumulation of who you are and who is an influence in you and what you find valuable. And whether it is art or science or anything, it is those influences, your environment, your circumstances that inspire the work that you do. And many people, I can speak for it on the book side since I'm a writer. Many people think writing a book is a one-person thing. And I think that's one thing that they don't hire editors or find find not co-authors, but find critique partners to help them do stuff. They use generative AI to do covers. But a book, a great work, is not something that is done by one person. You cannot build anything alone. You cannot, and I think that kind of shows a lot in my work, because pretty much all of my stories have to do with building a community, about finding a home and about finding your family, whether it's, the one you're born with or a chosen family. But you can't do it alone, and you never will do it alone. People are important to motivation, to love, to perseverance. And I want to assure you that the only way that you end up alone trying to do anything alone is by cutting other people off. But you're not alone, and you can accomplish anything you put your mind to. And don't listen to the naysayers. Don't listen to the Simpsons. Okay? You can do it. So with that said, let me know what your thoughts are on this. Link in the description below if you would like to get the full story of this book yourself. Read it. Enjoy all of the facts I did not put in here because this video is long already. Looking forward to your comments and the discussion about these wonderful men and this advancement. With that said, have a great week, and don't die.
To my children, Tommy, Ike, and Annabelle, if you forget everything else I ever said in the lifetime we shared together, I need you to remember 3 things. 1. Minimize violence done to and by women. As givers of life, it's against their nature, God's design, to do harm, and every act of violence done to them is meant to break their souls, turning what should be a giver of hope into a black widow, a woman who destroys the life and the mercy of her care for no other reason but the corruption of her own self. It is only when you come across these kinds of women that you should put them down, for they are no better than the men who tarnished them. However, take no glee in what must be done. Finding any life so far gone, a black hole is where someone's heart should be, leaves only one solution: the mercy of death, and it's a tragedy when it happens. Make no mistake, a woman's love is the most powerful thing on this earth. It can start wars, end them, and change the devil himself into someone God sees worthy of giving a second chance. She don't owe this love to anyone, but she do carry it around with her so long as she's living. That is why the devil will do everything he can to pervert women's nature and destroy their innocence. Of every crime you can commit during your lifetime, be it out of daring or necessity, for every defiance you may act out against God, government, or man, avoid harming the innocent, for the day that we become bloodthirsty beasts where love don't exist anymore is the day hell on earth has come. And as bad as it may seem at times nowadays, we ain't there yet. 2. Everything you do in your life will create consequences, both seen and unseen, extending further than you can imagine. Nothing you do exists solely within your arm's reach. Think about every decision you make, every action you take, because you won't know how long your choices will stalk you, be them destructions or blessings, rumors or history been made. The truth of the matter is, your life will be controlled not by the truth of what you've done, but by the way others carry on about you. And the thoughts of others are more real in the long term than what you know to be true. It won't stop affecting you just because it ain't real, and no matter the life you've lived, most men can't outrun what's written in them in ink. It ain't hopeless though. Be firm in knowing who you are outside of the noise, and live beyond the means of the news of the day. 3. There ain't anything stronger than a family you build for yourself. What you put together is worth fighting for. Protect your loved ones with your life, and they'll give theirs in return. Family ain't defined by blood, understand that. And for as strong as the bonds of your family are, know that you'll find just as much passion in the people who hate you. While you'll risk your life for those you care about, those who find your existence to be an insult to theirs will risk themselves to put an end to their affliction. As cruel as it may seem, a man who hates you will stop at nothing until one of yous is dead. It's a mistake to believe anything different. Don't let you be the ones taken from, be it by outlaw lawmen or by someone in between. The only one who'll be looking out for you is you and your kin. Maybe there's another way to be, but in all my years I've seen the worst of man, I ain't found another way around man's desire to conquer against all else. There ain't a changing of that mind, and sometimes I believe there ain't the ability for man to change at all, least of all through lead or legislation. I ain't claiming to be right about nothing. On many things, I don't want to be right, but what I do want is for my kids to live a better life than the one I did and avoid the mistakes that I made while finding the truth and purpose in what matter more than gold in this country. It's my hope that by sharing the things I learned that my kids will be better than their old man ever was, and that what I done isn't what people remember me for, but who y'all are going to become. That'll be the legend of Bill Cassidy.